Hello, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining us. My name is Linda Corchado. I am the director of the Children's Immigration Network with Children at Risk, and I am so excited to welcome you to our annual Immigration Summit. For those that are new, Children at Risk is a research and advocacy nonprofit leading the way in improving the quality of life for Texas children. Children at Risk considers the whole child by tracking issues in children's health, safety, education, and economic security. Committed to action beyond data, Children at Risk drives evidence-based change by speaking out on behalf of children. You can view the agenda for today's program and get to know our featured experts using the links dropped in the chat. If you have questions, please submit those for our speakers using the Q&A function. After the event, all registrants will receive the slide deck. Before we jump in, I'd like to take a moment to thank the folks who made today possible. First and foremost, let's give a shout out to our generous and engaged sponsors, Merrick and CLASP. We also want to thank our other co-hosts, the Children's Partnership. And last but never least, we can't forget to recognize our community partners. UPlan, the Texas Family Leadership Council, the Texas Racial Equity Collaborative, CTAN, Early Learning Alliance, IMSchools, Children First, Voices for Utah Children, New York Immigration Council, Coalition, Newcomer Success, Catholic Charities Archdiocese of Galveston, Houston, Nourish California, Molina Healthcare, and Santa Maria Hostel for your continued partnership in our immigration work over the years. I'm also pleased to welcome Gabby Benitez, Senior Policy Associate for the Children's Partnership, to provide opening remarks. Gabby, would you join me on camera?
Of course. Thank you so much, Linda, for the introduction. We're really excited to have everyone joining us today and for our great panels where we're going to be discussing the unique needs facing immigrant children and their families. So let's begin with a look into the data landscape and the state of immigrant children and families in the United States. We're going to be moving through this pretty quickly, but I first want to remind everyone that all registrants will be receiving a copy of the slides shared today. So delivering this first presentation is Senior Policy Analyst for Immigration and Immigrant Families with CLASP, Suma Sethi. Suma, will you join me on camera?
Hi, everyone.
Thank you, Suma. Pass it on to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today and welcoming me to this summit. I'm just going to give a brief overview on the number of immigrant children and children of immigrants in the U.S. Next slide, please. So 25% of all children in the U.S., or 18.6 million, are children of foreign-born individuals, so also children of immigrants. So when I say immigrants, I mean people who are born outside of the states or people who are foreign-born, regardless of their immigration or citizenship status. The majority of children of immigrants are U.S. citizens, 91%, and that's 17 million children. This map on the slide here depicts the share of children of immigrants in each state. This is a really great tool that anyone can access on the Urban Institute's website. They analyze ACS data from 2021, and it also shows trends from previous years and breaks it down by child age and state. The 5 states with the highest share of children of immigrants are California, New Jersey, Florida, Texas, and Nevada. Next slide, please. So children in immigrant families are racially and ethnically diverse. This graph shows the race and ethnicity of the children of immigrants. These are the blue bars as compared with the race and ethnicity of all children, the orange bars. And these are census category race and ethnicity. You'll see that the majority of Children of immigrants are Hispanic, then Asian, white, multiracial, Black, and Native American or Indigenous. Next slide, please. The majority of immigrant families are mixed status. And so what it means for a family to be mixed status is that different members have different immigration statuses. So a US citizen child might have a parent or an older sibling that is undocumented. The number of undocumented children in the US are 5.2 million. Or sorry, not undocumented children. These are the number of children that have at least one parent who is undocumented. And these are the number of children who are susceptible to immigration enforcement. The majority of them, 87%, are US citizens. This 5.2 number, they make up 7% of the child population, but 18% of children in poverty. 728,000 children themselves are undocumented. This is as of 2018. And then more than 250,000 children have parents with DACA status. Also, more than 360,000 US citizen children have parents with TPS or temporary protected status. This is a designation that protects non-citizens in the US, including children, from being returned to a country that cannot safely receive them and where they are likely to experience harm. It also provides work authorization. Currently, there are 17 countries designated for TPS. Next slide, please. I also wanted to define what it means for a child to be unaccompanied. So according to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is the primary agency that handles unaccompanied children, these include children who enter the country without their parent or legal guardian, as well as children who have been separated from their parent or legal guardian for other reasons. For example, children who are separated from their parents at the border are deemed unaccompanied. These children are primarily coming from Central America, from Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Mexico, and they are fleeing violence, especially gang-related violence, and they are in search for a better job and education opportunities. They are primarily male and older children. About over 70% are 15 years old and older. And in fiscal year 2021, 127,447 unaccompanied children were released to sponsors. Next slide. So immigrant families and children are longstanding members of our community. There are some stats on the slide here that I won't read out, but you can read yourself. Many of them have been here for over 2 decades. Children of immigrants and immigrant children are also disproportionately poorer despite high employment rates and high work effort. Next slide, please. And this is why immigration is a children's issue and is not a single issue policy. It spans every single policy sector that touches our everyday lives, because we're not talking about an issue, we're talking about a population, we're talking about children. Immigration policy is tax policy, it's labor policy, it's education policy, it's public benefits policy. All of these policies affect children's opportunities to thrive. It affects their development, their schooling, and their future economic and health prospects. And this is why CLASP and others have banded together to create the Children Thrive Action Network. Just putting in a brief plug there. Can you go to the next slide, please? The Children Thrive Action Network, also known as CTAN, is a national network that brings together immigration and child advocates to advocate for the needs of immigrant children and children of immigrants in particular. We have over 130 active members and allies in our membership. They span at least 20 states and expertise in a variety of policy areas. So I just want to encourage folks to please join us and just get up to speed on some of the issues that we're working on. We have several working groups, including federal advocacy, state advocacy, and research working groups. And we often work together to produce advocacy materials like sign-on letters, comments on proposed rules, fact sheets, and other materials. And I'll just hand it back over to our moderators. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suma. Thank you very much. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce our first panel discussion of the day. Rapid changes in federal immigration policy continue to dominate news headlines, with a particular emphasis on the response to asylum-seeking children and families at the southern border. Meanwhile, also other issues like access to healthcare for immigrants and increased concerns about migrant child labor also highlight the need for child-focused solutions. So this first panel will provide updates on this federal policy issues and propose ideas for how advocates can help shape the narrative on from a child's perspective. So moderating this discussion on federal advocacy is Martin Kim, Director of Immigration Advocacy at Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Martin will be joined in this discussion by Mina Dixon Davis, Policy Analyst for the Young Center. Also joining them is Juan Gomez, Senior Policy Analyst for Immigration and Immigrant Families with CLASP, and Mario Brisson, Senior Policy Advisor for the Women's Refugee Commission. As a reminder, you can also learn more about our guest speakers from today using the link dropped in the chat. And with that, Martin, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabby, and very warm welcome to our panelists. Thank you for joining us today. I just want to start by emphasizing something I think that we all agree and that Suma just outlined extremely well in her presentation, which is that immigration is clearly a children's issue. As Suma presented, immigration status within the family unit has really deep effects on the well-being of those families because of the way the intersection of the well-being of those families and our immigration system. But the perspective of children and families is often overlooked in the discussion of how we should be shaping federal immigration policy. And this is despite the fact that the federal policy space is host to a wide set of intersecting immigration issues that affect the health and well-being of children, non-citizen and citizen alike. These intersecting issues are unfortunately currently arising at a time of deep polarization on the issue of immigration. Given the split of power within Congress, with Republicans controlling the House and Democrats holding the Senate by a thin margin, we've seen that it seems almost impossible to move immigration-related reforms through law. However, federal immigration issues are not waiting for Congress to act, and we've seen continued and new developments related to immigrant children and families over the past few months and years. Today, we'll be providing updates on some of these specific federal policy issues and proposing ways to highlight the perspective of children in advocacy around these issues. So just to begin, I want to start with a question for Mina. So Mina, if you would, we've seen the end of the Title 42 policy, which was started under the previous administration. But even with the end of that policy, we've seen new policies at the southern border continue to limit access to asylum to those attempting to enter the United States. What policies are currently in place, and what does this mean for children and families?
Hello, and thank you so much for the warm welcome, Martin and Linda and Gabby and Suma. I'm so thrilled to be joining you today, and I'm really looking forward to the day of learning and listening ahead. My name is Mina. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a policy analyst for the Young Center on Immigrant Children's Rights. The Young Center, if you are not familiar with us, is a champion for the rights and best interests of unaccompanied children, that is, children who are arriving in the US alone, as Suma presented at the top of this call. And we are really striving to make sure that wherever children land, they are safe. Key to our championship is our volunteer child advocates. They spend time with and advocate on behalf of immigrant children. And also key to our championship is policy advocacy and pushing back against restrictive asylum policies, as you've mentioned, Martin. So to leap right into your question, I'm going to reflect back exactly what you started us off with. Immigration is a children's issue, and access to asylum is a children's issue. One that affects their safety, their family unity, and their hopes and dreams for the future. Last month, we saw the end of Title 42. This was a highly restrictive policy imposed by the prior administration. Title 42 is public health policy, not immigration policy. It doesn't say much about immigration processing, and it doesn't have any avenues for people who are fleeing for their lives to avoid removal back to the very places that they were fleeing. So Title 42 was an extreme policy that prevented asylum seekers from entering the country. And in fact, we saw caused family separations. Title 42, it lingered on and well into the current administration. But last month, the Biden administration lifted Title 42 and put new rules in place. Now, I want to flag here that I'm going to try and keep my discussion brief. And if you'd like a full walkthrough of protecting immigrant children in a post-Title 42 landscape, I'm happy to share later a link to a webinar that my teammates actually held earlier this week that will do all that and more for you. But on to some key factors of what's happening now. With the end of the Title 42 policy, the Biden administration has rolled out a new policy that effectively bans access to asylum at the border for many asylum seekers who are seeking protection, including families with children. Now, what are some key features of this asylum ban policy? To highlight just a few, the asylum ban requires asylum seekers to apply for and be denied asylum in a country that they traveled through first to be considered for asylum in the United States. Also, there is a requirement for people to remain in danger by using a flawed digital app called CBP One to ask for an appointment to enter points of entry. And then another problematic thing about the asylum ban is the use of expanded fast-tracked proceedings that are designed to deport asylum seekers quickly. And to return back to and expand on one of the most problematic aspects of the policy, the CBP One app, this requires that individuals and families schedule an appointment through a cell phone in order to be able to present at a port of entry. And we're finding that the number of appointments is completely insufficient to meet the need. And as a result, many asylum seekers, including children and families, are not able to access ports of entry or are forced to wait in line for days in the hopes of being able to cross. CBP One has a number of technological flaws. It also does not prioritize people with specific vulnerabilities. For instance, children, people with disabilities, people with extreme life-threatening medical conditions, and pregnant people. This whole process also does not account for the fact that many people simply cannot make an appointment through a cell phone. They may have a disability. They may not speak one of the few languages offered on the app. They may not be able to afford a cell phone or find a place with Wi-Fi access. All of this means that asylum seekers, including children, are being denied any way to seek protection at the border, and many are forced to wait in hopes of getting an appointment. But that's not all. Because even if a family is able to get through with a CBP One appointment, without a CBP One appointment, they are then subject to expedited removal proceedings. Excuse me. Which are designed to speed up claims to asylum and fail to ensure that families with children have a fair opportunity to be heard. In these proceedings, families only have a matter of days to prove their case. And we know that children need time and care when recounting their trauma. Families have already faced very dangerous journey when arriving at the border, and they need access to counsel. But in expedited proceedings under this asylum ban, the system is completely stacked against them. And that means that the vast majority of people, including children, will be deported in a matter of days. Now I know that there are other panels today that will focus on aspects of this policy landscape, like dangerous immigration enforcement, dangerous detention policies. So what I want to do with my time is really emphasize that restricted access to asylum leads to impossible choices for families and the further vulnerabilization of children. Unaccompanied children are exempt from the asylum ban, and there are scenarios where, because families cannot wait for the CBP-1 appointment to enter together, they will languish in danger and they will be forced to make impossible choices. Some may be compelled to separate. And once those families are separated and those children become unaccompanied children, they lose the protection of their most trusted parents, family members, caregivers. And they are further vulnerable to exploitation within the United States, which is actually something that my friend in advocacy, Mario, will be discussing today. So I just want folks to think about that link between restricted access to asylum and vulnerable children. And I hope people will really realize that children and families seeking asylum have faced extremely difficult journeys, and they deserve our welcome. And that's all for me today, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that detailed and thoughtful answer, Mina. I just want to take a second here to address a logistical matter. I see some people are typing questions into chat and Q&A. Please continue to do that. We'll answer questions as they come up, if that's possible. And we also have an opportunity for audience Q&A after the first set of panelist questions. So thank you. Mario, just to turn it over to you. So as Mina mentioned, and as we'll be talking about, recent media articles and investigations have kind of highlighted devastating and widespread labor exploitation of accompanied migrant children throughout the country. And we know that, just because there's new media attention about this, it's not like this is the only time this has happened. So I wanted to ask you what solutions advocates are pushing for to protect unaccompanied children and hold exploitative employers accountable.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. And thanks to my fellow panelists, as well as to Children at Risk, to CLASP, Americ, and all the other partners for this event. On the advocacy solutions, I want to start broad and then take us a bit narrow. So first, I want to begin just really on the employer side and with the public conversation. Among advocates in the immigration space, in the labor space, and the children's space, when we're talking about accountability for harms, our public focus really needs to be on the perpetrators of those harms. So consequently, we've wanted the public conversation to focus on employers. In that conversation, I see consensus really around 4 solutions. Those are increasing fines for companies who exploit children's labor. The current fines are so low that they're often written off as a cost of doing business. The second is expanding enforcement capacity federally through increasing the Department of Labor funding to do enforcement, but also in strengthening that local, state, federal coordination between the levels. This is especially important in places where state departments of labor have either been defunded or entirely eliminated. The third is joint liability. So right now, a number of corporations use labor brokers and subcontracting in order to evade legal liability, but still profit from child labor exploitation. And that has to stop. And the fourth is public accountability for the companies and brands that profit from child labor exploitation, right? We want people to recognize that. We want people to like call up Cheerios and ask, what General Mills is doing. But I'm guessing that most of the audience here is interested in the second set of policy solutions, those regarding children. When we discuss children-specific solutions to child labor exploitation, it's important to separate the children's conversation from the employer conversation. The child-focused conversation is largely about the quality of work. So what we want to do is ensure that children have the support they need, and that children who do work are doing so in ways that are appropriate to the diversity of children's needs and to children's best interests. Narrowing further to the unaccompanied children system, which is what that New York Times series focused on, that really kicked off a lot of the interest, at least in Washington, where I'm based. We know that immigrant children are especially vulnerable to unscrupulous employers. And we should also note that the children in the Times were Guatemalan, and largely among Guatemalans were indigenous. So in that space about the unaccompanied children system, how do we protect that specific group of children? We've structured our set of solutions around three key ideas. The first is prevention of child labor exploitation. The second is intervention when it does occur. And the third is improved service coordination. So to run through these briefly, prevention, how do we lessen the pressures on children to work in jobs they might not otherwise take? And maybe more broadly, what are the determinants of a working child ending up in an exploitative situation? One part of prevention is reducing the financial pressure on newly reunified families. So that's getting them financial assistance. A second part is work authorization. When working immigrant children lack legal options to work, the employers who do hire them are both more likely to be bad actors, but also the children's lack of options can impede pathways out of bad situations because the child perceives a need to bring in income for the family, but doesn't have a lot of different opportunities, different pathways for doing so. A third part is access to benefits and functional access to community-based services so that basic needs are met for the child, but also for the family that the child is part of. And a much smaller fourth part is education, such as ways to ensure that families are informed of their rights under US labor law. The second part, intervention. So when a child does end up in an exploitative situation, how do we ensure that an intervention solves the problem and that an intervention happens quickly? Our solution space has been largely around, to start, ensuring legal representation for every unaccompanied child. This is because in the UC system, lawyers often act as trusted adults and de facto often coordinate services for the child. The second thing we've been asking for is to start those relationships earlier, really as early as possible, if we can, before reunification, so before that child is reunited with that sponsor family member. The third, improvements in school-based interventions. And this is because schools are high-touch, high-trust institutions in unaccompanied children's lives. So these are things like co-location of services, making sure that teachers have referral resources when they notice problems, and strengthening and leveraging the low English proficiency and other resources provided by the federal government. And then finally, service coordination. So in care, unaccompanied children receive clinical services, and they often disclose important information to their case managers, to youth care workers, to those clinicians, and to other adults. When those kids go to communities, functionally much of that learning is lost. So the solutions here are first more effective post-release services through warmer handoffs, improved assessment and access to community services when they get there as well. The second, even in states that have sufficient newcomer services, the service providers in those places are often not in contact with one another. So one of the second asks is around federally funded state level coordinators, and this is analogous to what happens in the refugee resettlement system. Third and finally, beyond the sort of technical improvements to formal post-release services, really school-based service models using things like the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act funding, co-locating community services, not just for unaccompanied children, but for all immigrant communities, right? We want to be able to use the interest in this phenomenon to lift up all immigrant families. So that briefly is where we've been asking for, what we've been thinking of. To conclude, I'm certain that this group, both the panel and the audience, has a real wealth of expertise that's worth utilizing, both on the abstract, but also on the granular levels. So I just invite everyone to feel free to reach out in questions, the chat after the session. Would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much, and back to you, Martin.
Thank you so much, Mario. And yeah, just to echo that call, If folks do have questions, again, we will have a moment after the initial set of panelist questions to go to audience Q&A. Feel free to enter that in the chat or in the Q&A box. I want to turn to Juan now. Juan, I know immigrants, including those who are lawfully present or have status, have historically faced unique barriers to accessing healthcare, food, and other basic needs. What are the impact of those barriers on children, and what policy proposals have we seen by the administration and by members of Congress to address this concern?
Yeah, hey everyone. First, just want to say I'm really happy to be here today. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Juan. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Center for Law and Social Policy, which is a national nonprofit organization advancing anti-poverty policy. And to that question of the impact of these barriers, they're incredibly far-reaching. And what it means for children in mixed status families is that they go without access to those benefits you mentioned, like healthcare, like food assistance, which we know is really critical for that child's healthy development. Earlier today, we heard 1 in 4 children has an immigrant parent in the US. That's over 18 million children. And the very vast majority of those children are US citizens themselves. Yet, despite being more likely to be low income, those same children face unique barriers to accessing those safety net programs that are proven to help children in low income families to thrive. Those barriers can include things like language and cultural challenges and barriers. They can include other immigration related concerns around immigration enforcement. And they can also include the confusing patchwork of immigrant eligibility rules which exist in our country. Today, I want to focus on those, on the eligibility concerns, which really have an impact on children's well-being and being able to access these really critical programs. So since 1996, when the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, or PORORA, since that is a mouthful, passed, new restrictions were put in place to limit immigrants' access to public benefits. Immigrants with green cards now had to wait 5 years to be able to access public benefits, and other immigrants who were authorized to be in the US, such as those with temporary protected status, and eventually DACA recipients when that program was created, are completely barred from federal benefit coverage federally. So they do not have access to programs like Medicaid, like CHIP, like SNAP, housing assistance, et cetera, if it's federal public benefits. Since the passage of that law, there have been some changes, specifically to address, in a lot of cases, children's access to benefit programs. So the 5-year bar for children with green card status was removed nationwide in 2002. So any child with a green card themselves no longer had to wait those 5 years to be able to access SNAP. And over the past few decades, 28 states now have passed waivers to remove that 5-year waiting period for Medicaid and CHIP for children with green cards. While those are moves in the right direction, it's still not enough though. We estimate that about 2 million children in the US with a parent has a parent with green card, TPS, or DACA status, and due to that continue to be impacted by these barriers to public benefits. That's in large part because research shows that child well-being is closely linked to that of their parents. So even when children are US citizens themselves, they are less likely to be enrolled in benefits if their caregivers are ineligible for those same benefits. Additionally, when caregivers are able to fully access supports, it seems logical, right? Like they can better care for themselves, and in turn, they can better care for their children if they have access to health coverage and food for themselves as well. Again, immigration status and the restriction to benefits that come with it have a very direct impact on child well-being. Like I said, US citizen children are eligible, or if they meet the criteria, are eligible for these public benefit programs. But when they come from mixed status families, we see a drastic decrease in usage of those same benefits. US citizen children with a US citizen parent have a 4% uninsurance rate. That number doubles if they have just one parent who is a non-citizen. And if that child is a lawfully present immigrant themselves, they have a green card, they're 5 times more likely to be uninsured than a child with US citizen parents. Participation in SNAP also has dramatically decreased at a rate nearly triple that of children with US citizen parents. These are children who should be receiving these benefits, and for the most part, like I said, are eligible, but still go without coverage due to this very confusing patchwork of eligibility that exists across the country. There have been efforts by the administration and Congress to address these issues. This includes a recent proposed rule by the Biden administration to address barriers to the Affordable Care Act coverage for DACA recipients, which, when finalized, and the comment period closes tomorrow, so it hopefully will be finalized soon, would allow DACA recipients access to both health coverage under the Affordable Care Act marketplace, as well as the subsidies if they are eligible for them. And then in Congress, we've just last week, Representatives Jayapal and Cardenas and Senator Hirono just reintroduced the Lift the Bar Act, which would restore access to public benefits for immigrants and remove that 5-year barrier that I've been speaking on for green card holders, as well as the overall barrier for other authorized immigrants like DACA recipients. These are really, really important steps to ensure children have access to programs which support their healthy development, and will continue to push the federal government to pass laws and implement policies which limit this confusion and these barriers to care. And I'll pass it back to you, Martin.
Thank you, Juan, for such a detailed answer. And thank you again, Mario, Juan, Mina, for those answers to my initial question. I wanted just to turn now to talk a little bit about divided Congress, polarization, and our efforts and your efforts to continue to push Congress and the administration on some of these issues. Specifically, I want to note that, of course, the way polarization and the way some of these issues have become partisan or bipartisan is different for each of the issues that we've been talking about, right? Access to asylum, access to benefits, and then the labor exploitation issue. So given the unique context of each of these issues, first I'd like, and I'll go in order. First, I'd like you to speak a little bit to why it's important to continue to push Congress and the administration to implement policies that support immigrant families, and then also speak a little bit as to what children's advocates and providers, especially those on this call, can do to help. So Mina, why don't we start with you? Do you want to get us started?
Sure, thank you, Martin. And I think it is important to acknowledge the reality of the divided Congress that we're in. And yet I think it's equally as important to acknowledge that more unites us than divides us on these issues. And specifically what unites us is our values, our shared values of family unity, our shared values of children's well-being. These are not controversial issues, and these are issues worth uplifting. And then in terms of what can children's advocates and providers do to help, I think there is sometimes this idea that in policy spaces on the Hill, in state capitol, that children are voiceless and that we must speak for them. That's not true. Children are loud and proud about what they need. Children express that they want mom and dad. Children express that they need support and resources in community. They're not shy about this. Yet it's undoubtable that those of us who work with children, we have influence, we have power. And I think that starts by recognizing the power of children, the power of communities, and then recognizing the role that we can play in amplifying and uplifting those very critical needs, those very expressed wishes. Are we listening? Are we heeding that call? One specific way that people who work with children, that people on this very call who are affiliated with communities and organizations that are doing this work. You can ask yourself if you have the capacity for, in the context of unaccompanied children, to be a child advocate. The Young Center is in fact this weekend holding a training on what it takes to become a child advocate, what that role entails, how you could be involved in this very important accompaniment of children and uplifting their voices, uplifting their best interests to stakeholders where decisions are made about children. And then there's also heeding the call when there are these opportunities to unify on policies that make sense. And Martin, knowing you and knowing your wonderful organization and all the work you've been doing this session on bills that literally say in their summary, a bill to promote family unity, should not be controversial. You know, are those of us on the ground here ready to heed that call? Can we pick up the phone, dial that number and say, I support the Reuniting Families Act. I support the Children Safe Welcome Act. I think sometimes there's a real mystery around the way things work in Congress, in state, and sometimes it really is a phone call. So yeah, I'll just say there's so much that people are already doing that I want to acknowledge. And there's so much that we can do more to recognize the power of children and the power of communities.
Thank you for that, Mina. I want to just echo that idea that, you know, children have voices, and the people on this call, on this webinar also have voices and can get involved and should get involved to push for what, you know, are our united values around protecting children and families. Mario, I'll turn it over to you. The same question, and please take it away.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Mina, for the very powerful words about, you know, children's voices. I think, broad agreement from WRC, generally from me as an individual as well. I might answer this in almost a different direction than Mina, and this is not meant to disagree in any way, shape, or form. I am just like much more like focused on like, how do we get stuff done? Sometimes in like, okay, what are the tools? What are the things to communicate? And so that's the, like where my brain goes. I think it's really important for folks who maybe typically work at the state level to think about divided Congress, to think about political polarization as broader than just legislation. So I think everyone who is vaguely following the news probably is aware that it's very challenging right now at the federal level to get any legislation passed. There is an exception to that I'll get to in a second, but that's, and that is like a symptom of a divided government and polarization of our time. But there's other things that Congress does too, and those often have a lot of influence and are places where, because they get less attention and because people sort of advocates, members of the public ask about them less, you can often get a lot of movement there. So I'm thinking about things like oversight. So Congress has broad oversight authority about why certain practices are happening, why a process is looking like this instead of like that, why hasn't this kind of change that is strongly supported in the literature not happening at the federal level. All of that sort of oversight work is really important part of Congress and gets a lot of response in administrative agencies. The second one is that exception I was talking to. So the appropriations bills are still places where things can go through that do have sort of the power of legislation, although they are attached to the actual funding bill. So appropriations is the cycle by which we fund the government. There are 12 appropriations bills every year. Most folks on this call are going to be interested in just one of those, which is the Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education bundle. But even among that, I would say that there's a lot of attention to the HHS side, and there's not as much attention to the education side. So thinking about ways that you can use, again, like the low English proficiency funding or other things to benefit immigrant families, I think that there's not as much attention, there's not as much political polarization around that part of the budget. And I would encourage folks to think about how you can use that. And happy to chat with you, although I don't know education as well as I know HHS. About how to do that kind of work. And then finally, the last part is really in disbursement of funding. I mentioned the BSPA, the BSCA, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act before. That is still going, that was passed already by Congress. It's $1 billion. It's sort of the grant making part of that is still being decided. And so there's a lot of opportunity to say, hey, here's how we want to influence how these grants get made, what things you should be thinking about when you're making grants. There's a sort of granular level that often Congress doesn't mandate. And so administrative agencies have a lot of capacity to craft according to what they think makes the most sense. And those are places where especially local constituent granular expertise is just so important. And I would just really encourage folks to lift that up because you all probably have it. I think that's it from me, but thank you so much for the opportunity to talk once again.
Thank you, Mario. And yeah, it's a good reminder that even in times of political polarization, there are areas within, that we can engage in, including on appropriations, that still have some bipartisan processes, which is important to get things done. Juan, I want to turn it over to you to have the last word here. I will note just for the panel, we have about 5 minutes left. And after you go, Juan, I have a question from the audience for the panelists.
Sweet. I will be brief, but just noting the I know the impulse kind of when we have a divided Congress like this is to kind of throw your hands up and be like, well, we can't get anything done, we'll try again later. But just stressing how important it is to build that foundation of support now, so that when a window of opportunity does arise, and maybe that's 2 years from now, maybe that's 3 years, 4 years, 5 years from now, eventually a window of opportunity will open. And will we have enough support at that time to get these priorities that help children and immigrant families through at that time? The groundwork for that is really important to do now and to build that support. And these are issues that have been advocated on for decades. A lot of you have been talking about these issues for decades and decades, but it's important to keep educating. Congress is constantly churning in new members. Leadership is constantly changing, which means we constantly have to be advocating on the Hill and gaining that support. So just stressing the urgency there, and you all on this call are some of our strongest, most compelling advocates that members of Congress will listen to and they'll hear from, so that down the road, when a window does open, we can point and say, look how many of you support this already. This is a common sense thing to include in the package or the bill that you're working on. Please include it. And I really do think that's how we can get a lot of these wins through, but it takes it's going to take continued and constant pressure and support from members of Congress. And then just also stressing the other pathway is the administration on the short term. What can we do through the administration that they don't need Congress for policy-wise or to implement? So I will stop there and pass it back to Martin.
Thanks, Juan, and thanks for the reminder, yeah, that our work is cumulative, even in times when it feels like there's not that much that can be done because of a divided Congress. Our efforts, as long as we keep at it, do accumulate, do make a difference. I have 2 quick questions here from the audience before I turn it back to our moderators. Juan, this is a question for you. I think I know the answer to this question, but there is a request for you to share out materials with some of the stats on health insurance. I think it was on health insurance of children with ineligible parents. And from your nodding, I'm assuming that is going to go around. And then I have a question from the audience for all of the panelists, which is about resources available to children and families. It looks like it's specifically for those without status, because this audience member has a lot of families looking for homes, work, food, and resources, and just wanted to see if any of the panelists have thoughts about where best to access those kinds of resources, knowing that, of course, a lot of this will vary state by state and even locality by locality.
Yeah, I was just going to say just that a lot of it does vary state by state and by locality. So also happy to include my email, or I'll have the host share my email and information, and happy to be a connector and see if we can find the right person to talk to about that.
Great, thank you, Juan. And seeing no other questions, thank you again to our panelists for this very informative set of questions and answers. I'm going to turn it back to Gabby.
Thank you so much, Martin. And what an informative discussion. Definitely a lot happening at the federal level. So thank you so much for to our panelists for highlighting the important role that advocates have in shaping the narrative from a child's perspective. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our next session for today on how enforcement policies impact immigrant families. We've seen how immigration advocates continue to adapt in the face of complex and ever-changing immigration enforcement policies that have resulted in a huge number of law enforcement entities like Customs and Border Patrol, making government accountability and transparency an especially difficult endeavor. So this panel will explore how fabricated narratives of a border crisis inspire radical anti-immigrant policies, and how child-centered policies to keep our families together must remain at the heart of our immigration laws. So moderating this discussion is our very own Linda Corchado, Director of the Children's Immigration Network for Children at Risk. Joining her on this conversation will be Lindsay Wilkerson, Associate Director at the Children's Immigration Network. Joining them also is Rebecca Sheff, and Senior Immigrant Rights Staff Attorney at the ACLU of New Mexico. We also have Paul Chavez, Senior Supervising Attorney at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and Wendy Cervantes, Director of Immigration and Immigrant Families at CLASP. So with that, could you all please join me on camera? And thank you so much. I pass it back to you, Linda. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby. So I want to set the scene with the help of a new report that just came out entitled Still at Risk: The Urgent Need to Address Immigration Enforcement's Harm to Children by the Center for Law and Social Policy and Unidos US. The report makes a stark reality clear. We live in a country where nearly 5 million children have at least one undocumented parent, where approximately 360,000 US kids have parents who have temporary protected status, and 300,000 US born children have at least one parent with DACA status. All of these children live with uncertainty. Their parents do not have permanent, durable status and are at risk of having a parent detained or deported, or both. This report highlights a recent study that estimates that immigration enforcement reduces the median household income of affected families up to 47%, increasing their likelihood of living in poverty. Removing primary breadwinners from a household through immigration arrests makes a household more likely to experience foreclosure and less likely to enroll in government assistance that immigrant families are eligible for and which their taxes support. The impact on education is devastating. Numerous studies show immigration enforcement actions reduce student engagement and increased absenteeism, disrupting learning and future achievement. Enforcement activities have a tremendous impact on participation in and availability of early care education. With decreases in enrollment due to immigration enforcement activity, early education administrators report difficulty meeting enrollment goals, threatening the childcare supply for entire communities, and children are pushed to lower quality childcare settings, which can slow their cognitive and development progress. It's clear our lives are intertwined. Our shared hope is to live in a society that protects and supports all children. Our panelists today will highlight how these realities take shape now in our daily lives through anti-immigration policies, and how immigrant communities continue to rise in the face of so many challenges. Lindsay, thanks for joining me today, and we'll start in my favorite place, the border. Lindsay, help us set the scene here. How did the Texas legislature utilize the border crisis narrative to frame their border security bills?
Thank you, Linda. This has been something that we've seen in Texas and across the country. The border crisis narrative has been used strategically to paint the border as a threat to national security. This, in turn, has allowed for issues around human rights and the impact that this has on immigrant children and families to be ignored. This tactic has been used again and again to raise the specter of the border crisis. This has set the stage for a number of policies aimed at addressing what has been characterized by some Texas state officials as an invasion. Some of these policies were recently signed into law, including SB 423, which is legalizing the use of drones for monitoring the Texas-Mexico border as part of Operation Lone Star, SB 602, which is expanding authority of U.S. Border Patrol agents who have completed a DPS training. So current law only allows agents to detain certain individuals at established border checkpoints and points of entry, but now they'll be able to arrest, search, and seizure at these locations as well. And then SB 1900 designates Mexican drug cartels and criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations in the state of Texas. So border security continues to be an issue that we're seeing in the state legislature, and this is one of the agenda items of the current special session here in Texas. So it is likely that we will see additional laws come out of this session that are addressing the border. Presently, these bills are focused primarily on increasing penalties for certain criminal conduct involving smuggling of persons or operations of a stash house. So we do expect to continue to see these policies that are really not looking at the best interest of children and families that are coming across. And in response to these challenges, we've seen advocates mobilizing across the state and across the country to address these issues and to draw attention to these challenges and the negative impact that this would have on immigrant children and families. It's so important that advocates continue to present a united front and collaborate to make sure that the needs of children and families are protected.
Thank you, Lindsay. I know that invasion language is especially hurtful here in El Paso, where I'm based, where we had the Walmart shooting just a few years ago, where all of this invasion language also inspired the terrorists that came to El Paso. So still very raw, but unfortunately, we're still seeing that same messaging happening here in Texas. Rebecca, thank you for joining us today. I know that one thing Democrats and Republicans seem to agree on is the importance of keeping the borders safe, which manifests in huge expenditures on agencies like Customs and Border Protection. How does this level of deference impact the way CBP interacts with immigrant families living on the border?
Thank you, Linda, and thanks to all the organizers of today's convening. I want to talk for a minute about what we mean when we talk about border militarization, right? CBP, Customs and Border Protection, is the nation's largest law enforcement agency, and there's almost 20,000 Border Patrol agents in the field. They wield expansive and often unchecked power, which we see time and again resulting in misconduct and serious abuse. And we know that this is derived from an organizational culture of militarization, where agents are accustomed to acting with impunity, not being called out for their actions that result in harm. And Border Patrol itself, let's remember, has racist origins going back 100 years. Now, the border as well is what we term a border industrial complex. Border governance on the US side relies in large part on outsourcing to defense contractors. And so people, families living on the border are subject routinely to very intrusive technology and surveillance, including interior checkpoints up to 100 miles inland from the border, roving patrols by Border Patrol, where people are subject to stops and searches and seizures based on racial profiling. Some of the other tech we see in the field are license plate readers, automated surveillance towers, and aerial surveillance. And as Lindsay was just mentioning, in recent years, states have been getting even more deeply involved themselves in border enforcement in new and really deeply unsettling ways, from Governor Abbott's ongoing use of Operation Lone Star in Texas to the political stunt that Arizona pulled last year when they built a literal wall of shipping containers in direct violation of the law and at a huge cost to taxpayers. So what does this mean, right, for families who live in the borderlands? Families confront this highly militarized law enforcement ecosystem on a daily basis, and it's too easily normalized in people's day-to-day lives. People, as I mentioned, are at high risk of racial profiling and unlawful stops and seizures. Families who live on the border also face really significant barriers to accessing services. There's a fear of encountering these roving patrols. There's a fear of having contact with local law enforcement who might themselves get Border Patrol involved in their encounters with citizens. And undocumented individuals in particular are unable to travel through these interior checkpoints without facing apprehension and processing for deportation. So they're stuck effectively in this liminal zone at the border. This interferes with the family's freedom of movement. It interferes with children's access to healthcare, to education, and to other services. And it inhibits undocumented parents from helping their children access care. Families who live at the border also face limited economic opportunities, especially for young people. What you see in a lot of border communities is that often the only way to make six figures is to join Border Patrol. And young people are also particularly vulnerable to getting recruited for engaging in human smuggling or drug smuggling. So part of what we see here is a distinct lack of investment in border communities, even as Congress and states throw so much money at these militarized operations at the border. I will say too that people who live in the borderlands generally recognize that the border is a politicized space. They recognize that cross-border ties with communities in Mexico are something to be valued, and that people who are seeking safety in the United States should be welcomed, right? So the narrative that we so often hear coming out of DC about the border doesn't really line up with the reality of people's lived experiences on the ground. I want to touch for just a very brief moment on what this border militarization means for families arriving at the border seeking asylum. And I want to acknowledge here the very recent death of 8-year-old Anna, who died while she was detained with her mother in CBP custody. Her death is tragic and it should be seen as intolerable. We know in this instance that CBP staff and contractors willfully disregarded her mother's cries for help. We know that CBP reassigned its chief medical officer in the wake of her death, but there's still more questions than answers here. And we join with Haitian Bridge Alliance and many others in demanding justice for Anna's family. And I wanted to just recognize here the growing list of children who have died under tragic and preventable circumstances in CBP custody. So I think it's important to keep in mind that systemic measures for addressing harms at the border are critical here to avoid holding children and families in CBP detention for any significant period of time as they're being processed in as asylum seekers. Now, as Mina discussed a little bit in the last panel, the Biden administration has really wholeheartedly embraced this approach to border governance that's known as prevention through deterrence. And this results in people, including families who are seeking safety and protection, being forced into extremely dangerous situations at the border. And so what this means these days, as Mina was describing as well, is that people have extremely restricted access to requesting asylum at the established ports of entry at the border. People are also supposed to be able to just walk up to the border to be processed, but we're seeing in practice that that's generally not available. And as Mina was mentioning, people are being forced to go through this app called CBP One on their phones to try to get appointments. And there are lots of practical difficulties in accessing those appointments. The Biden administration recently imposed a new asylum ban, which the ACLU is litigating with partners. This prohibits access to asylum for everyone at the border who traveled through another country on the way to the United States, except those who can prove that they qualify for one of very narrow exceptions. And some people seeking asylum are being subject to another new policy where they're being forced to do their initial asylum screening interviews in CBP custody, where they have extremely limited access to attorneys and they're held in abusive and degrading conditions. Although this policy is currently only being applied to what the agency calls single adults from Spanish-speaking countries, it's important for us to recognize that a lot of people who are identified as single adults are actually people who are traveling with their families, who arrived at the border with their families, but they're not considered a so-called family unit under the definition that Homeland Security uses. So these are spouses, adult children, adult siblings, grandparents, aunts and uncles who have been separated from their family members at the border by CBP, who may be subject to these screening interviews in CBP custody with serious due process consequences. And families, as Mina mentioned, are being subject to expedited removal after in processing at the border. So even when they're released from CBP custody, they might be subject to intrusive electronic surveillance, including ankle monitors. And under a recently announced policy, they now might be subject to overnight curfews as well. And people who seek to provide humanitarian services at the border to families and other people seeking asylum are facing an increasingly hostile environment where their work is at risk of being criminalized, and people are at risk of facing a chilling effect of being deterred from providing humanitarian services to arriving families. I think I'll leave it there for now. Thanks, Linda.
Thank you. I mean, you capture the reality so well and the complexities to living on the border, where many of these law enforcement jobs are a pathway for people to enter middle income homes and households. So it's definitely a very complicated dynamic here on the border. Now, there is some progress here, right? Give us some highlights of CBP's new practice of publishing body cam footage. Where would you like government oversight and accountability to go from here?
Yeah, so last year, the Biden administration issued an executive order requiring federal law enforcement agencies to publicly post body-worn camera footage on an expedited basis for incidents that involve serious bodily harm or deaths in custody. And so CBP just started rolling out recently releases of footage for incidents in keeping with this executive order and its own policy on body-worn cameras. And we know certainly that body-worn cameras are far from a silver bullet, and they are not likely on their own to cause Border Patrol agents to refrain from things like excessive use of force or unlawful vehicle pursuits or other incidents that result in harm or death. But this is a significant new measure of transparency for an agency that has historically taken extreme steps to resist scrutiny and to thwart accountability for its agents. And so to the extent body cam footage as it's being posted going forward poses more questions than answers or reveals serious misconduct in particular incidents, it should be something that's galvanizing to policymakers and promotes calls for enhanced transparency and accountability. I want to mention too that CBP recently revised its vehicle pursuit policy, and that revision significantly tightens up the rules for Border Patrol agents in terms of when and how they can undertake pursuits in the field. And this is another important step to preventing harm to people who live in the borderlands and people who are arriving seeking asylum. It does remain to be seen, because this policy only went into effect at the beginning of June this year. It remains to be seen how effectively this will be operationalized in the field. And so there's numerous additional opportunities for transparency and accountability. I think it's critical for members of Congress to find the courage to exercise their oversight authority robustly and to use the power of the purse to address CBP abuses and misconduct, and to tackle systemic issues that pose threats to our border communities and to families who are seeking safety here in the United States. I think it's also important to mention and to recognize that CBP was deployed as a federal paramilitary force in 2020 to deter people from exercising their First Amendment rights in the wake of the death of George Floyd. And we need to be vigilant about the threat of any future deployment that might curb the civil liberties of not only people at the border, but people across the United States. So that's, I think, what I'd like to flag there.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I really appreciate your comments. They're really insightful. Paul, thanks for joining us. Much of our chat with Rebecca and Lindsay was identifying how militarized forces like CBP are operating in our border communities, causing fear and danger. We want safe communities, but we can't get there if we are afraid of our own law enforcement. Now, what all of us are seeing is that immigrants living in Florida are miles away from living in a society that embraces them, supports them, and welcomes them. Paul, help us understand what is going on in Florida.
Thank you, Linda, and thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here and thrilled to be on this talented panel. So the question, what's going on in Florida? I'll quote a colleague of mine. She often says that Florida is the state where ICE goes to beta test their bad policies. And I think that's absolutely right. We're seeing that here, and we've seen it increase. I think in Florida, we're seeing a multi-pronged attack on our immigrant communities. For this panel, I've thought about it in 3 different categories, maybe ill-defined categories, but I've kind of separated out, at least in my mind, for the panel. The first category of an anti-immigrant attack, I think, is an increase in entanglement, federal immigration enforcement with law enforcement. It's nothing new. I think for decades, we've seen the federal government, or at least certain sectors of the federal government, look to loop in local law enforcement agencies to try to enhance their own immigration enforcement activities. All too often, we've seen state agencies, local agencies, state agencies that are more than willing to oblige in those efforts. And here in Florida, we see them actively seek out those opportunities, including at the state level, at the legislative level. I think Florida is where we saw the invention of basic ordering agreements, which is basically just a made up agreement between ICE and a local sheriff's office to continue to detain people, even if that sheriff's office couldn't qualify for a 287G agreement. I don't know how familiar the audience is with 287G agreements, but that's basically set forth in the INA to allow sheriff's offices to continue to detain somebody if ICE issues them a detainer. So we've seen that increase. In recent times, we've seen local law enforcement being less willing to be vocally opposed to entanglement. I think in other parts of the country, and maybe even not as long ago as 4 or 5 years, we've seen Florida sheriffs, Florida police chiefs willing to come out and say, look, what we care about is the safety of our overall community. If we entangle ourselves with federal immigration enforcement, that's just going to lead to push people into the shadows. When people are pushed into the shadows, they're less likely to seek services, they're less likely to cooperate with the police, and that makes everybody less safe. So there was plenty of sheriffs that would take that stance. We no longer hear that voice from local police. There might be a few sheriffs that still hold that opinion, but they've been a lot less vocal. I think here in Florida, the Florida Sheriff's Association has been particularly successful in pushing that entanglement line. And it's incredible. It's we see them willing to engage in something so incredibly complex. Everybody here knows how complex federal immigration law is. You know, we've all heard it compared to only tax law in its complexity. And the idea that we're going to have local police engage in some sort of immigration enforcement is frankly ridiculous. We don't see them trying to engage in enforcing the tax code, right? We don't see police going up to the high-rise buildings in downtown Miami, shaking people down for their tax returns, for example, but yet we'll see them racially profile our community and ask people about their immigration status. So that's one category that we've the next I'll mention is state level preemption. And I don't mean preemption in the supremacy clause preemption from the Constitution, but preemption in this context, referring to a situation in which lawmakers either block or they prohibit a local ordinance from taking effect, or maybe they dismantle an existing ordinance or otherwise exercise state control over what would otherwise been a local decision making. We see this particularly in red states where they preempt blue cities. Particularly here in the South, there's really a racist history behind state level preemption, and we see it growing here in Florida and elsewhere more and more. An example of that is an attack on sanctuary policies. A few years ago, Florida passed a prohibition on cities and localities adopting sanctuary policies. So that was an attack on the local control. I think we're seeing the state level preemption more and more when cities want to enact some progressive policy, but the state pushes it back down. And we're going to see this grow. 3 or 4 years ago, I didn't think about it as preemption. I just thought about it as, well, these legislators are attacking our community again. But now, you know, it's become clear to me that this is actually part of their strategy, the straight state level preemption. So that's why I've kind of separated it out a bit differently. My third category is I think what we've seen this past year with the passage of SB 1718, and that's simply laws that are designed to make life more difficult for immigrants. Early on of the legislative session during SB 1718, I went around telling people, this seems like it's just cruelty for cruelty's sake. I can't believe they're doing this. What could possibly be the policy? But it turned out that despite my fear of being accused of hyperbole, that was the case. We saw that was the purpose of the bill. The legislative sponsor of the bill, Senator Agnolia, stated during the debate that was the purpose, that he wanted to make life difficult for immigrants here because that would then dissuade other immigrants from coming across the border and into Florida. So it truly was cruelty for cruelty's sake. The bill is awful. There's 22 different sections of the bill, each one designed to make life a little bit tougher. I won't try to go through all 22 in just 10 minutes, but suffice it to say that I think that was the purpose of the bill, and we'll continue to fight it.
Thank you, Paul. And how are communities faring in the face of so much vitriol in Florida?
I think that's a good question, Linda. I wouldn't, we've seen people leave, and I of course couldn't blame people for an exodus. And in fact, we've seen quite a few people, at least anecdotally. I don't know what the numbers are going to actually shake out, but I don't think that we could blame them. Recently, I saw some footage of a GOP representative, Rick Scott. He's the owner of a big giant farming operation here in Florida. He was on video at a town hall begging people to stay to work, but yet he voted yes on SB 1718, right? So as activists said, the state will accept our labor, but not our dignity. And I think that's exactly what we're facing here in Florida. I think the cognitive dissonance that Representative Roth had to go through to vote yes on that bill and then beg people to stay to work, is beyond compare. But I think it sort of leads to a bit of a silver lining. Maybe he'll be primaried. Maybe the other farmers will be mad about his election. Maybe they'll say, hey, we elected you to vote no on labor laws, not to hurt our industry. So maybe maybe we'll see a change in politics. And I think the silver lining is in Florida, this past legislative session, there was a big coalition that came together. So don't give up on Florida yet. I think the folks here are fighting. They're fighting hard. What we saw in California in the early 90s after the passage of Prop 187 drastically changed politics in California. It's too early to say that Florida is having our Prop 187 moment, but there's a strong coalition that's been built to oppose SB 1718. And I'll say the original version of SB 1718 was actually much harsher. So it was through all of that policy advocacy, community groups from all across the state, faith-based organizations, immigrant rights organizations, others that all came together, perhaps the first time, in years, to oppose the bill. And I think it made a difference. And I know that broad coalition is going to come back next season even stronger through the next legislative session. So hopefully we'll be able to keep that momentum and actually repeal some of the more harsh sections of SB 1718 and the laws that passed before, including the migrant transportation program that was recreated in Senate Bill 6B, SB 168 3 years ago, SB 1808 2 years ago.
Thank you, Paul. I mean, all eyes certainly are on Florida. I know at Children at Risk, we were just heartbroken to hear about that litigation and this exodus that's happening in Florida. Here in El Paso too, I met with migrants who had just arrived. We're planning on going to Florida, but now we're stranded in El Paso trying to figure out their next steps because they were terrified of moving there now. So it certainly has a chilling effect. And thanks for sharing those perspectives with us. Wendy, we also know that immigration enforcement is not just isolated to border communities and that families all over the country face the risk of separation due to detention or deportation. What are the trends that you've seen related to interior enforcement and its impact on families over the years?
Hi, Linda, and thanks. I'm really happy to be part of this panel today. And thank you also for flagging our new report, so I don't have to do that. I guess as someone who's been working at the intersection of immigration policy and children's issues for about 2 decades, it's been interesting to track the trends on immigration enforcement, in particular over the past decade, because there have been vastly distinct approaches. So first, let me just start by saying that there are many notable events that have shaped how interior immigration enforcement has evolved over the years, but I'll highlight just a few. One is the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and ICE of the Department of Homeland Security in 2002, and then of ICE in 2003, and CBP as we know it now as well in 2003. It's because I think it's important to remember that these agencies are relatively new, just 20 years old. Another is the increased collaboration between federal immigration enforcement with local law enforcement, which has really blurred the lines of the two, mostly to the detriment of immigrants in the communities they live in. And as Rebecca flagged in the border context, that's specifically because these types of collaboration create a climate of fear for immigrants who may be more reluctant to drive or interact with local police because of fear of being turned over to ICE as a result of a routine traffic stop, or even just reaching out to police for help. And it also increases the risk of the prison to deportation pipeline, in particular for immigrants of color who are more likely to be targets of racial profiling. And then another important trend over the years is the extent to which our immigration enforcement policies harm kids, most of whom are US citizens, by detaining and deporting their parents. You've highlighted most of those impacts already. For those, we know that even just the fear alone of potentially losing the parent has long-term developmental impacts. And for those who do lose a parent, for those families who do lose a parent, their lives are forever changed. I also think it's worthwhile to note that it's actually public outcry in response to the harm on kids that has actually led to policy change at different points in time. People most often recall the outcry to family separations at the border under the Trump administration, which indeed made a difference in putting an end to that horrific policy. But it was public outrage even back during the George W. Bush administration that led to an eventual end of worksite raids until the Trump administration, as well as the creation of the first set of humanitarian guidelines for ICE aimed at safeguarding the well-being of children impacted by large-scale enforcement operations. And this was true under the Obama administration as well. While we saw a shift in enforcement strategies under that administration from the very beginning, with a new set of enforcement priorities aimed at deprioritizing parents and caregivers and others who have strong community ties, and to ensure that they could get prosecutorial discretion and be safe from deportation, we were still seeing pretty high deportation numbers across the board during the early years of that administration. But a few years into the Obama administration, more research started to come out about the detrimental impact of deportation on children, including long-term impacts. In 2011, Congress began to require ICE to report on the number of parents of US citizen children that were deported each year. And several reports and studies came out, including one that found that detained and deported parents who had children in the foster care system were having a really hard time reunifying with them. And in some cases, parents were being deported and having their parental rights terminated without an opportunity to even show up to their family court hearing. So it was after that we finally began to see some really targeted policies really aimed at specifically mitigating the harm of enforcement on children. One example is the sensitive locations policy in 2011 that restricted immigration enforcement activities in schools, hospitals, places of worship, and other sensitive places for kids and families. And another was the Parental Interest Directive in 2013, which was aimed at ensuring that parents who are detained or deported can make decisions about their children's care, including their kids in the foster care system. And then, of course, enforcement really ramped up in a way that can only be described as a nightmare under the Trump administration. Not only did they immediately make everyone a priority for deportation, but the administration really dramatically shifted a range of policies on both border and interior enforcement. And in just a matter of weeks, we really saw the effects. Parents who had previously been granted prosecutorial discretion were showing up to their annual check-ins with ICE, and instead of being told that they were having their prosecutorial discretion extended another year. They were being told that they were going to be deported in a matter of days. Some parents never went back home. And the number of parents started to go up again. And we saw the return of large-scale worksite raids, including the largest worksite raid in US history that happened in Mississippi on the first day of school and many of the places where those raids took place. And the fear was widespread. And research we at CLASP conducted during those years, we heard from families and educators all over the country, some with stories about children as young as 2 who were demonstrating symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And we started to once again hear stories of families preparing for possible deportation and avoiding even the most basic outings, like to the grocery or to the doctor, out of fear of running into immigration agents. So now under the current Biden administration, much of the harmful policies of the previous administration were overturned immediately, and several positive policies have been announced. One is a strengthened parental interest directive. Another is an expanded version of the sensitive locations policy, which is now known as the protected areas policy. But as many of you know, the Biden administration's enforcement priority guidelines that are similar to what was under the Obama administration have been held up in the courts, which makes it harder, though not impossible, to exercise prosecutorial discretion. But given political pressure related to immigration broadly, unfortunately, advocates remain rightfully concerned that there's still much more that the current administration should do to protect families at risk of being separated, especially given that the prospects for a pathway to citizenship are highly unlikely and that we're facing a potential end to the DACA program. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Wendy. That is a great picture for us to see how our laws have evolved. And it's just been this painful back and forth for immigrant families, as you've described so well. Thank you all for asking some questions in the chat. I know we had one answered by Rebecca. Thank you for that. Quick follow-up though, Wendy, how can immigration enforcement policies currently uphold the best interests of the child? What can advocates and community members do now?
Well, I mentioned that there's still a lot more that should happen under this administration, but there's also some small, meaningful things that can happen sooner, including things like sensitivity training for all agents that may come into contact with children, as well as consistent implementation of some of those good policies I mentioned, and also more investment in alternatives to detention that not ankle monitors or surveillance types of alternatives, but alternatives that are community-based and provide supports to those who are awaiting their deportation case. But I think on a larger, more systemic level, we ultimately have to end the practice of detention and deportation. And as I mentioned earlier, this collaboration between the criminal legal system and the immigration enforcement is deeply problematic because the criminal legal system is already so deeply flawed and rooted in racism. And the bottom line is that as long as we have this punitive immigration system, immigrant families are going to continue to be at risk. But that being said, I also want to flag what I mentioned earlier, which is that community members and children's advocates do have a role in reaching out to local, state, and national policymakers to lift up the stories of children and families they work with every day, talk about how they're critical members of the community, and urge policy members to reject these policies that criminalize these communities. It's made a difference in the past, and I really think that advocates have a role to play, lifting up the perspective of how this impacts children moving forward.
Thank you, Wendy. Our agency still matters, right? Even though the system may feel so gargantuan at times. We just have 2 minutes left. We have a question for Paul. What can immigrants in Florida do who fear their civil rights will be violated?
Thanks, Linda. Thanks for the question. Organizations, including SPLC, have been working hard to conduct not just SB 1718 education webinars, helping people understand what SB 1718 does and what it doesn't do. In fact, there's actually a lot of misinformation out there about SB 1718, so we're trying to address that. And at the same time, conducting Know Your Rights presentations. More often than not, Know Your Rights in the context of SB 1718. By way of example, Section 10 of SB 1718 amends Florida's human smuggling statute, and now it makes it a felony to transport, I'll use undocumented as shorthand, although the phrase they use is in the bill itself is actually different, but transporting somebody into Florida, they entered unlawfully and has not yet been inspected by the US government. So that's really a broad category of folks. So people are worried, that the person driving isn't the person who triggers their immigration status, doesn't trigger the felony charge. It's the person being transported. So people are wondering, how are police going to know what happens, if I get pulled over? Are police going to go around asking people about their immigration status? So all of those Know Your Rights presentations are, I think, critical and will be critical here in Florida for quite a while. I would recommend going to FLIC, which is the Florida Immigration Coalition. Their Facebook site will list all of the different Know Your Rights presentations that have been happening and will happen around the state. There's a few representatives that have been holding town halls, and they include Know Your Rights information.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to our audience. We really appreciate it. Back to you, Gabby.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was so great information. Thank you all. I think that we can all agree that any design of any mechanisms that aim to protect the safety and the well-being of children should prioritize and consider the difficulties that children in immigrant families, many of whom are also immigrant children, should be prioritized because of the result of any anti-immigrant policies that affect their lives. In talking about challenges that children in immigrant families face, I'd like to introduce now our next session today on education. All children, regardless of immigration status, have the right to access to education. This was established in 1982 in the Plyler versus Doe Supreme Court ruling, and the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, and other state policy efforts such as supports for newcomer students continue to support and address the needs of immigrant students. So this next panel will explore the best practices in newcomer programs, how to engage parents and caregivers in the educational outcomes of their children. It also looks into some of the current challenges to access to education and the innovative solutions to meet immigrant students' needs. So I'm really excited to introduce you to Juan Rangel. He's gonna be moderating this conversation today. Juan is a federal lobbyist for the National Education Association. Joining him is Viridiana Carrizales, co-founder and CEO of IMSA Schools. We also have Dr. Marie Moreno, a newcomer specialist, and Muna Hussain from Family Engagement for supporting partnership in education and beyond. Juan, please take it away. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gabby, and great to be here virtually with everyone. I want to thank Children at Risk and the Texas Family Leadership Council and all their partners and sponsors who put together this great and very timely summit for all of us. As mentioned, I work at the National Education Association, also known as NEA, and we represent educators at every level and in every profession who work directly with immigrant students and students who come from immigrant families. And also remember that we also have many educators who are immigrants themselves. So we're deeply invested in protecting and investing in our immigrant communities so the whole country can thrive. And these last few years have not been easy for immigrant students and schools, more broadly speaking, as bad actors at every level continue to use immigration as a political tool and public education as a political tool. We see more and more attacks against immigrants, including immigrant children and students. We know all students, regardless of immigration status, have a right to a free and quality education. Not only do our immigrant students benefit from this, but the rest of our schools and the broader communities benefit from learning about the experience, the perspective, and the humanity of our immigrant students. So as politicians muse about potentially ending the right to an education for our undocumented students and attempting to use this fight to dehumanize immigrants and divide us, we must stand united in defending Plyler v. Doe, which defends this right to an education to all students, regardless of immigration status. We must speak up constantly, repeatedly, and loudly for the benefits of an educated population again, regardless of immigration status. And we must act to ensure that our schools are properly resourced to be able to properly provide for culturally diverse, linguistically diverse, and socially diverse student population. So how can we act? We need to make sure schools continue to be safe zones and not be sites for immigration enforcement efforts. We need to invest for a diverse educator workforce that looks like, talks like, and truly reflects all our students. We need to continue to fund public school resources so all the unique needs that immigrant students have are truly met. We need to stop the book bans and ensure that all our students are getting an honest, truthful, complete education that acknowledges all communities. And we need to call on Congress for permanent protections for our immigrant students, our immigrant educators, and a broader immigrant community. So I'm excited to serve as moderator for this panel with an amazing group of advocates who also understand the importance of education and are active in ensuring that this is a reality for all our students. Before I turn to them, though, I want to remind our audience that to send us questions as we hope to answer one or two towards the end of this panel as well. With that, let me turn to Viridiana first. Providing a safe and inclusive space for immigrant students is vital to their ability to learn. This is all the more necessary for undocumented and mixed status students. So what are some of the challenges faced within the school system to create these kinds of environments? And how can engagement from schools and parents help address and prioritize these needs?
Thank you, Juan, and thank you for Children at Risk for inviting me to be part of this conversation. As an organization that is working with educators to support undocumented students and students with mixed status families, we are witnessing firsthand the challenges that exist in our schools to support this population in the way that they need to in order to thrive and succeed in our schools. So one of the biggest challenges that we are seeing is this critical gap in knowledge that exists in our schools about the needs, the rights, the protections, and how educators can holistically support our immigrant students in our schools, especially our undocumented students or students that come from a mixed status family. So just to provide some context, there are approximately 5 million students in K-12 who are either undocumented or part of a mixed status family. Here in Texas, that is 1 out of 8 students in our classrooms who are impacted by their immigration status. So we need to be paying attention and be very critical about prioritizing this community in our schools. One of the ways in we're seeing this gap in knowledge showing up in our schools, and just to provide some examples of how that is or what we're seeing. One is, there are educators who are asking families for their social security number when they're enrolling students in our schools. They are front office school staff who is asking for a driver's license as parents come into their school to either enroll or pick up their children or participate in school events. There are counselors who are misinforming their undocumented students about the opportunities that exist in higher education. There's also, counselors or teachers who are planning field trips outside of the state or even within the state of Texas, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, for students who live in border towns that are not able to access these opportunities. There's also sessions where educators are requiring students to complete FAFSA, and just like this lack of information that exists and lack of awareness about the opportunities, the resources, the protections that this community specifically are able to access does not exist in our schools, and that is impacting the ability to build trust and for our students to feel connected and feel like they can be advocates for their students' education. So for us, this has become a priority. I do want to say that, I believe that, this gap in knowledge is really the result of a lack of action and from really our federal government or our state government and prioritizing our students. So there's really a lack of funding that comes to in terms of supporting this population in our schools. So if we're not holding or really looking at this in terms of who's responsible for what we're seeing in our schools, like we cannot hold our schools accountable for things that are also should be we should be holding our state and federal government accountable for. So I hope that all of us can continue to think of these long-term policies and protections that need to be in place in order for our students to truly like thrive and succeed in our classroom. So those are some of the things that we're seeing and some of the things that we're working on to make sure that our students, especially those who are undocumented, feel protected.
Thank you so much. And just a follow-up question, are there role models that you have seen, or what are some successful ways to meet some of these obstacles that are inside some of our schools?
We have seen school districts, and we're partnering with school districts across Texas, and San Antonio and Dallas and Houston. And we're seeing some great steps from districts who are prioritizing not only funding, but hiring staff within the district to support this population. We've seen welcoming centers in our schools that provide information about the rights that students and families have, regardless of their immigration status. There has been practices put in place, resolutions enacted by the board and the districts to really convey and communicate the rights that exist for our students within our schools. So there has been some great steps forward steps that our districts are taking, but there's definitely needs a lot more support and more actions that we can take in this space.
Thank you so much. That's super helpful. Thanks, Viviana, and I'm sure we'll come back to you a little later, but I'll turn it over to Muna now. Supporting the education of immigrant children can require a multifaceted approach. So it's important to look at holistically identify the many supports that are needed. So what are you and your group doing to support the education of children in the community, and how have the recent challenges to our education system had an impact on access for immigrant students?
Hello to you all. Thank you so much for inviting me in this space. My name is Muna Hussein, and that question is really sometimes difficult to answer, because one of the things we might think is a basic, which is the most difficult, is to understand the American system, the education system. The community who comes from, as we all know, comes from small cities, rural area, who used to know the teachers, their parents used to, those teachers were a member of their community. It was not formally meeting your teacher or the school, but it was seeing them in the neighborhood, knowing them. The children know those teachers, those educators were part of the community, which is not the case. This is not a system where education is built with immigrant cultures or immigrant, a way of learning or understanding or their languages. So the biggest really barrier is that basic level of understanding. I drop my child in this big building, and somebody who I don't know is holding my 5 years old, then what? The fear of, does that person care my child? Do they know? Do they know their cultures, their food, how they, react, what they like, what they don't like is one of the things, the biggest really difficulties of immigrant communities. And we don't talk about it. We don't really talk about it. We think that schools are, you have to write as a child, every child in America to get educated, but in what cost? In what environment you're going to be succeeding in that space, and not seeing somebody, even the students when they are in there, not seeing somebody look like them. It's also another layer of who do I trust? I remember one time I went to school and I was helping a first grader, and there was this young first grader who is from Vietnam, but she had a hijab, and she really showed me like, oh, you look like me, I love you. And that's where she starts. and you have the hijab. And I felt like we did not look like each other. But the way I cover my hair was the way that young girl covered her hair. And the word she said to me is, I love you. She did not know me. So those are the things really we focus the community to understand, yes, this system is different. You don't know those teachers, but make sure that you participate in the schools. You know, at least try to know, what the system, what your students are learning. But there's another also difficulty of, are the schools welcoming them? I had like some districts are hiring the people who look like them, those communities. But the overwhelming of like, I am one person at the school, the community day and night is calling me about every small things, about every big things. I might be there hired for 4 hours. Who's paying that? Who's acknowledging, the responsibility those immigrant, staff is taking to support their communities. So then when the students are in the school also, are they learning their cultures? Are they becoming proud of where they come from? Because I have seen, and we have seen many young students from Africa who telling their teachers, please don't tell anything to my mother or father, they will take me to Africa. Because what is in Africa? And I definitely believe a lot of young Latino are also going through the same, crisis of like, because the news is telling that all the negative things are not kind of like really celebrating who they are, and their cultures and their languages and, their food. We have seen young students who hiding the food their parents are giving to them because students did not know those kind of food, and they're asking, smells bad, what are you eating? And they're coming back really not touching the food and say, Mom, don't give me the food. Don't come to my school. We have seen that also because you look different. And other students are asking, like, why your mother is like that? Whatever that is. It is really, it is so difficult when we're talking about, quote unquote, who's here legally or documented and documents, and not seeing all those parents. One of the things they feel is like, okay, this is American life, this is American dream. Now my child is school, they're going to succeed. Very soon they're going to be in a workplace and make money, and that is, my way out from that poverty and that struggle and all that. But it's not, most of the time it's not happening. And students who are succeeding in high school and doing well, then higher education is coming. We have seen many of young students who the deadline, they did not know. Their parents were supposed to sign some of those, waivers, and they did not know, or they did not understand. And it becomes too late for them to, get to that university. So it is really difficult. So one of the things we focus the most is to that level of understanding of the system. You have to understand where you come from, the way you used to talk to the teachers, the way you used to, know the teachers. This is a different. You have a rights. If you don't speak the language, you have the right, not your child to interpret for you, because we have seen many teachers who using the 7 years, 8 years old, to translate for their parents, or sending a Google Translate to home. And those parents are like, I don't know this language. It looks like my language, but maybe you should send me to English so my 8 years could could at least pick up some couple of those words. So one of the things we really also reaching the districts is to come to the space of those communities, to listen their conversations, to listen their struggling, to understand, there is no them and us. If we want all of us, educators and parents, the success of this child, we have to know each other. We have to come together and understand each other. Those children have to know, their cultures is not different. It's just one of the other cultures. It's not bad or good. There's no us and them. It's this beautiful, diverse communities in America where every culture is respect, love, and appreciate.
Thank you so much, Miranda. That I really appreciate it, and thanks for highlighting both a lot of the challenges that many students and their families are facing in the educational system, but also how your group specifically is helping educate on how we can make those settings a little bit safer and a little bit more welcoming for all our students. So thank you again for that. And finally, Dr. Moreno, the needs of newcomer students are unique and diverse. There have been a number of programs created to support these students and elevate their strengths. Can you talk about the importance of these programs and what best practices look like when supporting newcomer students? And what impact does this have on their overall educational outcomes?
So thank you again for having me. Thank you, Linda, Gabby, Suma, and everybody on this call. It's just such a nice place to be where I this is my I reek education for immigrants and refugees. So I am an educator for about 30 years now, working specifically with refugee and immigrant children. I was the founding principal of Las Americas Newcomer School in the Houston Independent School District, where I was the principal for 18 years. I tell people it was my blood, my heart, my sweat, and my tears. I had the opportunity to work with so many immigrant children that were in their first year in the country, who didn't know what to do, how to do it, where to go, or anything, scared, and families who didn't know what to do either. And so now I'm the consultant for newcomer success. And so now I'm supporting people across the country. I've supported districts opening these programs that you're talking about in and around Texas, South Carolina, Alabama, Louisiana, Arizona. And so because we need programs like this to help support our immigrant and refugee families, because they don't understand what is America education like in the first place, right? Many of them have never been to school in their own countries. Many of them have interrupted schooling because these schools are dangerous in some places now. I've had the opportunity to visit a newcomer school in Tel Aviv. I've been to a refugee camp in Chingwali in Uganda, so that I can understand what is life like for these refugees, so that I can be a better advocate, a better bridge, better support our teachers and our staff and our schools so that they can better understand. I've gone to the remote villages of Guatemala because I realized that not everybody in Guatemala speaks Spanish. There's lots of indigenous languages down there. And when I found out from a student at my school, when the little boy says, Ms. Moreno, ¿cómo se dice esto en español? And he's showing me a phone. And I was like, come here, why are you asking me, what is this in Spanish? And he says, oh, I don't speak Spanish. My first language is Quiche. My second language is Spanish, and now I'm learning English. And so I had to go to Guatemala to figure it out for myself because, students can't really articulate that information for me. So I went down there, and that's when I found out there's 27 different languages down there, and the common language is Spanish. Things like that folks here in the United States don't understand. You know, a student who is Spanish speaking is their second language shouldn't really be in a bilingual program. They need to be in an ESL program because Spanish isn't their dominant language. They're having to translate Spanish into Quiche so that they can go back to Spanish again. It's very similar to what we do with our ESL population. But anyways, you talked about newcomer programs and the importance. And so it's absolutely important. And unfortunately, we don't have enough, whether it's for funding or whether it's because the people just don't understand. But I really do look at programming from kind of, you have to, it's a very complex process. Number one, leadership is important. You have to have the right leadership. You have to have everything from the district office all the way to the school principal, and it trickles all the way down. If you don't have that leader, that principal who understands immigration, understands the whole facets around supporting the whole child, then you're not really going to get what you want to get out of, right? Because it requires lots of different avenues to make sure that you're addressing. I kind of look at it from 3 different areas. You got to work on the educational piece. You got to help support them with the language. The second thing that you have to look at is the social emotional piece of it too. Many of these kids are traumatized, whether it was their journey to get here, or it may have been the trauma that they experienced on a refugee camp, because many of them were even born on a refugee camp. So they don't really understand the whole facets of, you know, life in general, and they know what it is on a refugee camp. And that's why it was important for me to experience that. And then the third piece is resources. So if you don't have those 3 pieces of information, and again, you go back to, going back to the educational piece, so I can kind of discuss those 3 areas. Again, there's different areas. We have kids who don't know the alphabet because they've never been in school. Other kids have been very well educated and they just need what I call code switching, you know, understanding how to then transfer your knowledge and your experience and your education from your first country, your first language, and then transfer it over. And then you have kids that also just need the comprehensible input, kind of understand what you're saying and what you're doing, so that I can then support, be better in school. The second piece also that I talked about was the social emotional piece. Some schools and some principals, if you will, don't see that as a need, and it's very much a need. If kids don't feel good in school, don't feel welcome, just like Muna was talking about earlier, you know, kids are not going to learn. They're going to end up dropping out. They're going to end up saying, you know what, they don't want me here in school, or they're going to bully me, or they're going to, you know, they're going to make fun of me, those kinds of things. How do you make that environment inclusive, making it a place where it feels safe, where we celebrate our diversity and not necessarily tear us apart? You know, I tell people all the time, you know, we're trying to acculturate our students, not assimilate them. Muna also talked about our students that the hijab. I can recall a student on my campus. She would come to school. She was from Iraq. She would come and she would wear her hijab, and then I would see her go to the bathroom and then take her hijab off. And then when her parents would come pick her up, they would put the hijab back on. And I would say, why are you doing that? What's going on? And her comment was, no one looks like that. No one else has a hijab on. So I don't want to look different, right? And so what did we quickly do? Because newcomers have to be flexible and move at the speed of the kids, right? We didn't have very many Arabic Muslim students at the time. And so we brought in folks from colleges, right? Muslim students from colleges. And then we started getting more students enrolled who are also Muslim, wearing hijabs. And we wanted to celebrate that. And students were saying, now I understand, because we want them to see, we don't want them to lose their culture. We want them to embrace the new culture they're in, but still keep their own. And then lastly is resources. At my campus, I would tell people, we have a comprehensible wraparound services at the school, because we provided everything from a community closet to provide clothing and supplies for their apartments or their homes. We had mental health. I know Children at Risk was a big part of that. When we were trying to, again, support our mental health, we had individual, we had group, we had family therapy to support our families. We had healthcare for our students. We ended up getting a grant so that we can do that. Dental, food pantry, mentorships, internships. And then I was so excited to hear Paul Chavez talk a little bit about Know Your Rights presentation. Oh my God, here I am clapping away, because we also did that on our campus. We wanted our families to make sure that they had rights in this country, and what were they? So we provided those types of presentations at our newcomer program. And those are things that I then share with all of those other states that I help open newcomers so that they too can provide that type of support and service. As far as best practices, let me tell you, there's just so many, but the three that I can pull up really fast is one, listen to your students. Listen to what they say, listen to their stories. Their stories are they're so unique, first of all, right? Each one of them, there isn't an identical story that they can tell you. They have seen things in their eyes that I cannot put into perspective because I was not there. I've tried. I've been to a refugee camp, but 18 days has nothing to do with sometimes 10, 15 years that they've been on these camps, right? I did not come through this journey. I did not walk to Guatemala when I went to go visit. I flew on a plane, right? These students came on the Bestia. They came trying to get here, and in many of them deported because they were found illegally coming up here, and then had to be sent back to their home country. So I've read books where they talk about these journeys and how families and students and unaccompanied students come and make this journey many, many times. And then the last one is, show empathy was my number 2, is show empathy for our students, right? Show them you care. If you show them that you care and they know that you actually are trying to support them, they will move mountains for you. They are the smartest kids I've ever seen in my life, because they will perform for you if they know you cared. I always tell people all the time, if you're working with refugee and immigrant children, expect resistance. These children have been dismissed. They've been, and they'll tell you, Miss, leave me alone. I don't care. You know, why are you doing this? Stop telling me this. I don't want to hear. And I tell people, that's what you're going to get, because they're used to that. They're used to those kinds of things. And then lastly, just challenge students. Sometimes we don't want to provide challenges for our students, and they feel like, oh, pobrecitos, you know, they don't know. And that's not true. They can do it if you give them that opportunity. Don't make the expectations too high so that they can be reached, but then move that needle as they reach those and celebrate those small goals. And then what you said as far as impact, what's not to impact, right? If you provide the right solution, I tell people all the time, I have 2 children of my own, and I put my kids in early childhood, right? In early childhood school. So they've been in school since 2 years old, right? Because I wanted that foundation. Programs, newcomer programs will support our new arrivals, because it's going to provide them the support and the foundation that they need so that they can be successful, and they can be great advocates. They can be great promoters in our community. I've had, again, thinking about 18 years in working in this community, I have doctors and lawyers now who were immigrants before, and now they're still undocumented, or some of them have already been received their green cards and now, you know, citizens, and there's just so many great stories out there. But because the first thing they tell me is, you gave me that opportunity. And so, it's just, we just got to give them the right medicine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morin. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing all those insights. I kept on like nodding, like yes, to everything you were saying. And thanks for uplifting the Know Your Rights. That was something that was mentioned in one of the questions as well. I think that's and was mentioned earlier in the conversation as well, in terms of just how complex immigration already is, and each I feel like month there's something new that is changing either at the state level, the federal level, the local level, and so the more and more we can do Know Your Rights, whether that's related to ICE enforcement on school campuses or other information that is vital to both parents and the broader community. And then we also had one question as well about the intersectionality. We know that the immigrant students are not just coming as immigrants. There's an intersection of identities that they often come with, whether that's we have LGBTQ plus immigrant students coming in, variations in income levels and poverty levels that we need to address. But there's a specific one also about immigrant students with disabilities and very unique needs that community needs. So one of our attendees asked how to best identify and service these youth, particularly if they are older newcomers. I'm curious if anyone has any insights into that space specifically.
So I work also in elementary school, and in many cases, what we're noticing is not only the physical disability, but also if the students is, special need or IEB or needs a certain way of, to evaluate and to educate that child. In many cases, a lot of immigrant community, they did not have that opportunity. It was not, exist in where they come from. I always say to the teachers, they only know normal and not normal. So when you say my child, there's something wrong, that means my child's not normal. So the defensive, it starts of like, why? The doctor did not say anything. The doctor say this child is healthy. At the same time, the language we use, when you translate, it is so negative. And we still don't understand how to create those languages where communities who are not, English speakers can understand and see, okay, there's nothing wrong with my child. The way they learn is different. So how can I allow now this school to do that process where they can be qualified, some of those, supports that they would get. So that is a big challenge. Is a big challenge. Another challenge is also, as we all know, most of the counselors at the schools, they don't look like those kids. So the way they share and the way they react and the way they act is not that amazing. I always say white counselor who never seen this culture or this the layer of either not sharing or in that culture of a weakness. If you share too much, not understanding how to get that from that child, which could be, could cause mental issues, depression, so many things is also another thing. Still, we are not focusing. We are focusing like generalizing, but there's another layer on top of that for that child who is immigrant, that child who might be now understand that, speaking the language, in a middle school, high school, but how can he share or she share that with her parents who did not understand that? It's like, what's wrong with you?
Right.
You are fine. So this is a thing also, because we focus in a lot of the conversations and mental issues and support those children, but still, what about those children who are coming from immigrant parents?
Right.
Juan,
you,
let me
Linda.
just tell you
Yep,
one
go
thing
ahead.
in 1 minute. It's one thing is talk to the parents, right? So I work with the secondary level newcomers, and I got so many of my students officially labeled with special education services simply because we did a lot of documentation. Okay, so what are teachers doing, right? I'm teaching them the alphabet. I taught them these, 5 consonant sounds, taught them these blends, and then how much are they retaining, right? Because some of it is about retention too. So it's this cognitive level of understanding, and then documenting that, learning a little bit about their backgrounds. Were they a premature baby? Were they, were they dropped as a child? Did they get, those kinds of things all help when you're putting this case together. So I can talk more about that, but because it is a very complex, and really nobody wants to touch it because they always want to say, well, it's a lack of opportunity. No, it's not sometimes a lack of opportunity. It's just that there is something wrong. And again, working with newcomers for so long, I can definitely speak to that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to the 3 of you. Our panel's out of time, but I really do appreciate all the insights that you've shared with our time together, and we look forward to listening to the rest of the summit. So I'll turn it over back to Gabby.
Thank you so much, Juan, for moderating such an amazing discussion. I once was a newcomer student myself, so I really appreciate the thoughtful conversation on how best to support newcomer students and their families, which is essential in ensuring that they have a successful transition into a new country, which means a new life for them, right? So with that, I'd like to announce our 4th and final session, which is state efforts to support immigrants. For this session, panelists from different states will be discussing the work they're doing to support the well-being of children and immigrant families at the state level across a variety of issues, including food insecurity, health coverage, and early childhood education and development. So I'm really happy to introduce you to Mo Hickey, who will be moderating this conversation. Mo is Executive Director of Voices for Utah Children. Joining him from New York is Lisa Schwartzwald, Senior Manager of Economic Justice and Family Empowerment at the New York Immigration Coalition. From California, we have Betsa Bell, Director of Engagement at North California. From Pennsylvania, we have Donna Cooper, Executive Director of Children First Pennsylvania. And finally, from Michigan, we have Deborah Rookie, Staff Attorney from Michigan Immigrants' Rights. So Mo, I pass it on to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby, and thank you for Children at Risk for hosting us all today. This has been a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to our conversation that's about to start in a second here. I want to preface by saying, as someone who leads a state organization, it is frustrating at times because we look at the federal policy and we know we have to follow federal policy at the state level, but then sometimes the interpretation of the federal policy at the state level doesn't necessarily benefit certainly immigrant children and refugee children. And we see that firsthand where I am in Utah on a fairly regular basis. And the challenge sometimes is trying to find workarounds to some of these issues, trying to find where federal policy is not being followed properly. So there's a constant churn of work in all the areas that we've talked about today, whether it's healthcare, early education, parental rights for their children in the schools. So I appreciate all the work being done on the federal level, but I think a lot of times the actual more difficult work is when you're working at the state level, trying to figure out all the things I just mentioned and how to implement the policies in a way that does benefit the immigrant children in particular. So with that, I'm going to start off with a question for Liza. And it's regarding early childhood education, which has been shown to have positive effects on the development of children, However, immigrant children are less likely to be enrolled in pre-K. Can you talk about how we can better create equitable access to early childhood education for immigrant children and the work you're doing with the LIFE Project?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And maybe I'll just introduce the New York Immigration Coalition as well. We are a 200 plus member-based organization outside of New York. So we have offices all across New York State. And we do all sorts of immigration policy and advocacy work. So I cover all of our early childhood work. That's what I'm here to talk about today. Now, about, let's see, 8 years ago or now, 2014-ish, New York City started rolling out its universal pre-K program under Mayor de Blasio. And this was like a really big revolutionary thing. Everyone was very excited about it. A couple of years go by, around 2017, we get contacted by the New York City Department of Education. And what they were finding, and I'm sure this is not a surprise to anybody here, was that immigrant-centric neighborhoods in New York City were not applying and enrolling to the new pre-K programs in anywhere near the same numbers as other neighborhoods were doing that. So the NYIC, as we are a partner organization, reached out to a few of our community-based organizations that do a lot of sort of on-the-ground grassroots work. We don't do direct service work ourselves, generally speaking. This was actually one of the few programs that we have that was direct service. And those groups were MASA, LSA Family Health Service, and Fifth Avenue Committee. And we said, okay, let's do some of this outreach and enrollment support ourselves, and we will both help families out there actually, get their kids into these programs, and also kind of figure out, well, what's going on? Why weren't they enrolling in the programs themselves? So in 2017, we founded the LIFE Project. LIFE stands for Linking Immigrant Families to Early Childhood Education. And the purpose of that was really to provide a lot more intensive one-on-one support than the DOE was able to give really anybody. Even right now, they only have about 26 people on their outreach team, and a student population that's like a little bit under 1 million. So you can imagine that they can't do a lot of that hands-on work themselves. And we knew that we had a lot of limited English proficient families who were out there, and also digitally disconnected families who were out there. And even I think the most recent numbers we have are that we actually have 165,000 parents of children ages 0 to 4 in New York City right now whose families are limited English proficient, and about 100,000 who lack access to the internet or a computer. Now, progressively, New York City's enrollment process was going more and more online, and that actually, got really accelerated during COVID, when, of course, they stopped printing directories for pre-K programs. They stopped communicating via paper. They closed our family welcome centers, which were traditionally the ways that our families could go somewhere in person to get enrollment support. So over the course of that project, we kind of did a lot of trial and error, tried to figure out where are families, like where can we actually do the kind of outreach, how are we finding them? And our projects, the outreach people on our projects would go out and hang flyers in grocery stores. They would go do presentations at churches and synagogues and mosques all over the city. They would go to laundromats, all of the places in these kinds of areas where we knew that families were going to be congregating or were going to be passing through, and where we could communicate with them. Now, over the course of the project, we started asking the questions to the families directly, right? Like, what exactly is it that's keeping you out of the pre-K program and ultimately the 3K program, as it's not universal yet. We're actually in a little bit of a conversation about that right now in the city, but 3K is just pre-K for 3-year-olds. And by and large, those families gave us those two reasons, right? They said the language access is like non-existent when it comes to the actual outreach portion of things. New York does require you to kind of print things in other languages, but they don't do anywhere near the amount of outreach in those languages as they could. They're not like sending out people, to speak in Spanish or in indigenous languages. I know that some folks earlier mentioned that many of the immigrant communities that we have do speak Latin American indigenous languages. So, our DOE doesn't have anyone who even speaks those languages, I don't think, at this point. So, we were really working through community-based organizations to do that because they looked and sounded and were from those same backgrounds. And they were able to do that kind of, actual outreach. So the families had told us, language, that's the biggest one. And the second one is it's all on the internet. I don't know how this works. I don't know how to go on what's called the My Schools website and find a school and then figure out what I'm eligible for, because all of our programs are on there together. So even though we might have a public 3K or pre-K program, we also have early learn programs and Head Start programs and extended day, extended year programs, all of which have separate eligibility. And obviously parents take a look at that. And many of the families we were helping, they didn't have any kind of analogous 3K or pre-K system in the country that they came from. So, when we had to do the outreach, we didn't just have to go say, look at the sign over there that says you get free 3K. Like a family's like, what is that? What does that mean? What is 3K? It's like a made up thing. So we would go and we would say, hey, let us tell you what 3K or pre-K is. Let us tell you what the benefits of early childhood education are, that your kid's going to be more likely to succeed academically, less likely to be part of the criminal justice system, more likely to, graduate high school. All of these things were, we already knew at this point were linked to a quality early childhood system. So we would go out and we would tell families, this is what this program will do for you. And then we would actually take them through the whole process of applying and enrolling. And for a lot of families, that meant we're making them an email. We're, creating a My Schools account for them while they're sitting there with us. We're like writing these things down because they don't know or understand kind of what these pieces were. And over the course of the whole project, we helped about 650 families through this. And I would say that notably, even during the COVID pandemic, when we were seeing like something around a 13% drop in enrollment in all of these programs, just because families weren't applying in the same way that they were before, we didn't see any dip in our numbers because the outreach we were doing was still very, very effective. And we would ask families kind of at the end of this process, during this process, could you apply? Like, could you have figured out how to do this on your own? And 4 out of 5 of the families said no. Had we not had this kind of, outreach and enrollment support, had we not had somebody to actually walk us through this process, we would not be in these programs. Now, as I kind of alluded to earlier, right now, as part of our city budget process, which is supposed to end at the end of this month, we'll see whether it does, we are pausing the 3K expansion, right? So there was supposed to be more 3K seats that opened this year. We have a lot that are still empty in different neighborhoods. And the DOE has told us, and the mayor is kind of saying to everybody, well, we are not doing the expansion because we just don't need these seats. And we're turning around and we're saying, you have 165,000 parents of 0 to 4-year-olds who are limited English proficient in this city. We know from helping that exact demographic to apply to these exact programs that 4 out of 5 said they couldn't do it. 80% of them said by themselves or with the available DOE resources, they cannot apply and enroll in these programs. So, we're kind of pushing back on obviously the closing of this expansion and, trying to make sure we don't especially lose any additional seats. But we're also pointing out that particularly in this moment, when New York City has received somewhere to the tune of 18,000 school-aged asylum seekers in the last year, that those families of the youngest children, but also, of our older children who are coming in as newcomers, that they need that level of outreach in order to actually fill the seats that they're supposed to be in. So I think the kind of overall lesson here is, and again, I think as immigrant advocates and policy experts and everyone else, that, we cannot have universal systems of childcare, of early childhood, even of K through 12, without acknowledging that you need to build a dock for the boat that you've built, right? That for immigrant families, they need the outreach and the enrollment support in order to actually get into the universal program. And it's not just a question of, are you able to, are you eligible to be in the program? You really have to actually provide the resources and the groundwork and the legwork to get kids into those programs. So maybe I'll stop there. I wasn't looking at the clock, so hopefully I didn't overdo it.
No, that was great. And one of the conversations we have a lot in Utah is what's the actual intent behind some of these programs, or the way they monitor the program, right? If you want to keep people out, it's very easy to do so. And we've got to find ways to get people in. So appreciate those comments. Betsabel, food insecurity has a detrimental impact on the whole family and their future outcomes, as we know. We also know that immigrant children and families are at a higher risk for food insecurity. Can you talk about the Food for All Coalition and the impact that this will have on immigrant children and families, particularly those in mixed status households?
Great, thank you, Mo. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank Children at Risk, the Texas Family Leadership Council, and the Children's Partnership for the invitation to speak at the summit. So a little bit about who we are. Nourish California, we're a statewide organization that advocates to ensure that every Californian thrives and has equitable access to food, resources, and opportunity. I'm the Director of Engagement, and I'm located in Los Angeles. I want to start off actually talking a little bit about myself, because this issue around food insecurity and immigrant access to food is very personal to me. I'm actually an immigrant myself, but I wasn't undocumented for a very large part of my life, and actually really struggled with accessing food growing up. We didn't have access to programs like SNAP or Medicaid, and I remember relying heavily on school meals to be able to eat throughout the day. So I know what it's like to go hungry and not have access to food. And this is why I'm so passionate about our Food for All campaign here in California. And I want to say that this is not, our Food for All campaign is a very young campaign, but it's not a new issue. We've actually been working on this issue for many, many years. In fact, we've had a lot of tries in passing legislation and policy in California to expand food assistance to undocumented immigrants, but we just have not been successful. So this has been years in the making, but I will say that the pandemic actually helped us launch this campaign in 2021, because food insecurity among undocumented immigrants was a very prevalent issue. Everybody was talking about accessing food. As you know, many of us were sheltered at home. It was immigrants that were actually helping us put food on our tables. They were the ones that were putting their lives at risk, either working in our fields as farm workers, or working in grocery stores as grocery store workers, or were helping us deliver food. And so immigrants were helping us, making sure we were getting food, but yet they were struggling with accessing food. And so it was in everybody's face. We were talking about how do we get access to food? And so that's what actually helped launch our Food for All campaign in 2021. And like I said, it is a very young campaign, but we actually have had a lot of success in those 3 years. In fact, last year, the state invested money so that we could expand our, we call it the California Food Assistance Program, which is a state-funded program in California. And it is a mirror of like our SNAP program in California. And the state expanded our CFAP program to undocumented immigrants over the age of 55. And we're very excited about this. We will be the first state to expand these benefits to undocumented immigrants. And right now we are working to try to figure out when we could expand these benefits. But I know that this already is making a lot of change. And right now, the Food for All, a little bit about who we are as Food for All. Our goal is to expand our CFAP program to immigrants who are excluded from federal SNAP, or as we call it in California, CalFresh. And we want to expand them. They're mostly undocumented immigrants, but it does include DACA recipients, as well as TPS immigrants, or temporary protected status immigrants, and as well as other visa holders. And that's the goal of the campaign. We have a very large coalition. Actually, we're over 110 organizations across the state that are coming together to making sure we expand our CFEP program to immigrants that are excluded. And like I mentioned before, we've had a lot of success in our Young campaign, but it is true, it is really because of our coalition. We wouldn't have been able to have that state investment made last year if it wasn't for our coalition. And I think the uniqueness of this coalition is because it is both, it's diverse partners coming together of both like anti-hunger, anti-poverty, and also immigrant rights and grassroots organizations coming together to address this issue from an immigrant perspective. And so our partners are, like I mentioned, there are more than 110 partners. We actually sub-grant 10 partners. So we give out mini grants to local grassroots organizations to help us be part of this movement. And so those 10 mini grant partners actually help us with collecting storytelling and helping uplift the voices of those who are directly impacted. They actually support with helping mobilize people to legislative hearings, to help us get people to attend budget hearings, or to call the governor, or call our legislative leaders to support Food for All. And so there's a lot of a direct engagement. And this is the uniqueness about our coalition is that, and about the campaign, is that we are moving this policy change not for immigrant communities, but with immigrant communities. And they're at the forefront of our campaign. We're making strategy decisions, policy conversations with our immigrant communities. And like I said, engaging them in every step of the process in our legislative and budget process. And we know that makes it easier when you're sub-granting local grassroots organization and you're moving those, redirecting those resources to people that actually work directly with the immigrant community. So we're very, very proud of that. Lastly, I will say we, in terms of the campaign, we have definitely had some success this last 3 years. We've moved legislation and budget, but I will say this year has been incredibly challenging in California. I don't know how many people know, but we are in a budget deficit, and so we're in a tough situation. Our budget is not looking really great, and so right now the conversation is about protecting our wins, protecting our investments, but at the same time, pushing our governor in California to do more. We are actually one of the wealthiest states in the nation. We're actually almost, I think, if not already, we have the fourth largest economy in the world. And we are very rich, not only in the economy, but in the food we produce. We not only feed our Californians, but we feed everyone else in the nation and in the world. And so it is ironic that in the state where we have the richest foods and economy and diversity, where we have people who are struggling to accessing food. And I'll just lastly share some data that we actually conducted last year in partnership with the California Immigrant Policy Center, who is actually our co-sponsor for this campaign, and the UCLA Center for Health and Policy Research. We analyzed some CHIS data that actually showed that nearly 45% of undocumented immigrants in California are affected by food insecurity. And actually for children, 2 in 3 or 64% of undocumented children are affected by food insecurity. So food insecurity is impacting all immigrants in California, but certainly for our children who are part of immigrant families. And so we want to make sure we address that, we solve that, and we can do it. We have the resources. It is about just prioritizing our resources and making sure we're investing them in our California immigrant communities. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that was a good point to highlight, that you do have the resources. And I think we see that in a lot of states at the moment, that certainly in Utah, we call it the culture of scarcity. They've created this false scarcity. Our legislature will constantly tell us we have the #1 economy in the country, but yet we don't have enough money to pay for school lunch, things like that. And it's a pretty regular playbook. So I sympathize. Donna, Access to healthcare has a direct impact on the overall well-being of immigrant children and families. There are many challenges in access and care disparity for immigrants. How is the Dream Care Coalition working to address some of these challenges, and what kind of impact would this have on you in Pennsylvania?
Thank you so much. I have learned so much being here today and listening to from top to bottom. A shout out to Suma from CLASP. I'm on the CLASP board, but to all the sponsors of this event. This has been so informative. And if only the US Congress was sitting here listening to us right now, we would see things change. The experience has been dramatic. We are based in Pennsylvania, and we are based in southeastern Pennsylvania. But interestingly, first of all, we're a purple state. We have a Democratic majority by 1 in the PA House. So basically, we have 2 chambers that are Republican with a Democratic governor. We have been trying to pass something called Dream Care, which is focused on expanding public health insurance eligibility to undocumented children. And so by way of background, I want to say that we began this work because we were talking, we do a lot of free care for families that are underinsured, who don't have dental insurance, don't have eyeglass insurance. And so we're always, as a child advocacy organization, also connecting parents to free healthcare resources. And one of our dentists that we work with said to us, you know, this is the third, when I started my job 11 years ago in the first week, this is the 3rd kid in 2 months where I have had to replace all of their teeth. And I can't imagine the pain of that child who was 8 years old. When I have one toothache, he said, when people have one toothache, they run to me moaning. Imagine how this child felt with every tooth in his mouth decayed. And I said, well, what's driving this? And he said, well, he's undocumented. He has no access to getting any healthcare in Pennsylvania. And we then, during our free days of eyeglass care, started talking to families who are coming in, and clearly 40% of the families who are coming to get children eyeglasses so they can see in school were not able to get eyeglasses through public health insurance. And we began to then mobilize with the parents who do get public health insurance to say that children who are undocumented in Pennsylvania deserve the right to health care in Pennsylvania. And another piece of background is that Pennsylvania was one of the first states to create a state CHIP program, Children's Health Insurance Program. Our state program was developed in 91 and was the model used by Clinton in 96 when they created the federal CHIP program. So we always like to say we were the first health insurance program for nearly all kids, but not all kids, right? So one of the things that we started to do after we saw this experience firsthand was talk to immigrant families, and we partnered with the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia to survey parents of undocumented children who had children without legal papers all across the state. And I just want to share a couple stories in addition to what I told you that were pretty telling. One mother said, who had 2 children when she lives here now, but she came across the border with another child. So she's a mixed status household. She said, all 3 of my children have asthma and they share one inhaler. And so one kid gets a puff a day, the next kid gets a puff a day, the next kid gets a puff a day, and then they start over. Not acceptable, clearly. Another said that her son had been expelled from his school sports team because the coach was so concerned about his safety, knowing that he had no access to health insurance. He did not feel like he could responsibly let this young boy play soccer. And the kid stopped going to school. He was so depressed. We had parents tell us that their children were chronically depressed with no access to care. One parent had the child had horrible GI issues, no access to care. And then another parent told us that her child had a broken bone that could never get set, and the kid's in constant pain. While this was happening, we had a very well-known lieutenant governor named John Fetterman, who's now a US Senator, and his wife, Giselle Fetterman, herself grew up as an without papers in America, and was a child with epilepsy here. And so Giselle's experience with epilepsy, the parents' experience of firsthand horror stories, and the survey that when we asked parents sort of and aggregate their healthcare experiences, 9 out of 10 said they had not looked for healthcare for their children because they couldn't afford it. So they hadn't seen a doctor in more than a year for their children. 91% said that they had delayed taking care of a serious medical condition like going to a clinic or a hospital. 1 out of fear, but 2, they were worried they were going to have to pay for it. And 67% said that their child was suffering permanent harm as a result of the delay in getting access to healthcare. So we turn these stories into, testimony for our state lawmakers and for recruiting now more than 110 organizations that are advocating for what we call Dream Care in Pennsylvania, which would give children access to Medicaid. We actually are agnostic about whether it's Medicaid or CHIP, but for budgetary reasons, Medicaid's easier. For context, 10 other states are already doing this, and shout out to Utah, which is I think, pretty red state, that they could possibly get this done is a shining light for the rest of us, because all the other states that have done this, if you are like us, are not blue states. And so Utah really breaks the mold of a place that isn't blue, where kids can get access to public health insurance. I also point out that Massachusetts was one of the first states to make this possible when Mitt Romney was governor, a Republican governor. And the Republican governor of Illinois also has twice reauthorized their expanded health care for these children. As Suma pointed out, there are 728,000 children who are living in the U.S. without legal citizenship papers. We think there's about 30 to 40,000 of them in Pennsylvania, very small. And I just want to give a shout out to all the big immigrant states, because you teach us so much. And it is because of California and New York that we pursued this work. So we have a small population, but we learned from your experience that we can and must get this done. One of the reasons that we've been able to build bipartisan support is that we talk to lawmakers about 4 specific challenges affecting these children. One, we're very clear that when children don't have access to healthcare, they present a public health issue for every kid. You know, they have a flu, they go to school, and other kids get sick. So it's not that we are saying they are, a pariah, but if we want to stop contagious disease in school, every kid needs to be insured, just like we approach vaccination. We also made a case that recruited our school nurses, our educational infrastructure into this coalition, because ensuring kids have healthcare will boost their school attendance. Lots of research on the relationship between illness and school attendance. We also showed that kids were more likely to do their schoolwork. If you're suffering from a toothache, just as if Betsabel talked about, if you're hungry, you're not going to do your schoolwork. Same if you're not feeling well. And then the last thing is that enculturation and affiliation, that having kids be shut out of sports activities in their communities was a recipe for disaster for so many kids who are new to America, and it's how they're going to build relationships with other kids. And in addition, our kids need, we're able to get in Pennsylvania immunizations for kids, but lots of kids need, physicals to be able to enroll in things that are associated with their enrichment. And these families don't have access to those physicals unless they live near a clinic or a public health department. And most Pennsylvanians don't live near a clinic or a public health department. So we have also built very strong partnerships with the insurers, the Medicaid insurers, children's hospitals, the major primary healthcare systems, pediatricians, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Medical Society, the Hospital Association. We have tried to build a coalition of people who have great influence with the lawmakers, together with the families, to make the case that this is also good for the healthcare industry's bottom line. Because if we don't pay for the preventive healthcare, as we all know, we're paying at a higher end down the road. And for our health institutions that are, especially the rural ones, where we have many, many immigrant children who do not live here with citizenship papers, they're on the brink as it is. So every kid they have to provide free care for is a challenge for them. So we almost got this passed 2 years ago, even with a Republican majority, but we weren't able to really get it over the end zone. And so we began to look around and realize that every state that had passed it had at least one Democratic chamber up until Utah. And so we really think that Utah now is the shining light for us to replicate. Now, I want to say finally that when we say 10 states have access for children who are living here without citizenship papers to get health care, it varies. In some states, it's up to 8 years old. In some states, it's up to 26 years old. In some states, it's up to 18. In some states, it sunsets. In some states, it's an entitlement or a state-funded entitlement because you can't do this with federal funds. And in some states, there's a set amount and there's a waiting list. In some states, it's through the emergency medical and Medicaid, but there's a flip that lets the state then pick up the money after that. So there's many devices that are used to make this done. To the federal panel, if any of those folks are still here, when we reauthorize CHIP next time, or there's any major Medicaid bill that passes, we ought to automatically ensure enrollment of children who are living here in our country, trying to grow up, live the American dream, and need obviously access healthcare to do that, just like every kid. In fact, that's the argument we use with our state lawmakers. There are many Republicans in Pennsylvania who are not happy about what they call undocumented immigrants coming into America, even though we have a labor shortage. And so maybe they're getting happier, but they are very clear that they are interested in doing this for children. Children has been something they've been willing to step forward on. And we've been able to build strong bipartisan support. And now that we have a Democratic House, they're brand new, and we have a Democratic governor. We're hoping next year, after lots of conversations with Utah, we're going to pass this in Pennsylvania. So that's what we're up to here.
Well, thank you, and I do look forward to those conversations because it took a little bit of time to get it passed, but also it's good fiscal policy. That was one of the things that we really had to reiterate on a constant basis. Just from the state level, they were saving twice the money they were going to put in, not including the big hospital groups, et cetera. So there's a lot of layers to it, but happy to work with you on this. Great. Well, Deborah, unaccompanied children are one of the most vulnerable immigrant populations. Can you talk about the challenges you see for unaccompanied children and what you identified as some of the best practices in providing protection and support for their long-term well-being?
Yeah, so just a little bit about where we're about the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center where I work. So the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center is a legal resource center that serves all of Michigan. It's for Michigan's immigrant communities. However, in part due to funding, quite frankly, and in part due to demand, our largest team is our unaccompanied children's team, which is where I work. So to explain how unaccompanied children get up to Michigan, I'll tell you a little bit about what the process is for that for those of you who don't work with them. The number of migrant children who entered the US without a parent or legal guardian reached a record high last year. So after apprehension at the border, UCs usually spend a little bit of time in a transitional foster care setting because they can't spend, there's a statutory limit on how long they can spend in a detention facility. And then most are either released to a sponsor or they're placed into long-term foster care. Sponsors and foster care providers can be anywhere in the US, and there are even 2 very large foster care networks all the way up here in Michigan, which is where I personally work day to day. So because of these placements, we end up seeing a lot of cases up here in Michigan. Last year alone, we saw our UC team handled 1,156 cases of unaccompanied children. Unaccompanied children experience all the challenges of other migrant populations, but because they entered the United States alone and because they're a young age, usually teenagers, but some even younger, they have very specific vulnerabilities that we need to address when we are dealing with their populations. So today I want to talk a little bit about healthcare and labor practices, which are 2 of the more significant, but by no means the only challenges that these youth experience. So starting with healthcare, UCs have experienced trauma just as a population, as individuals. every UC that we see coming up here has experienced some form of trauma. That could be trauma in their home country, which may have been a significant factor in their decision to migrate to the US without their families, or others experience trauma on the journey to the United States. And due to our practices at the border, many have traumatic experiences at the border or once they enter ORR custody. That trauma and the harsh working conditions that many of our UCs worked in prior to coming to the United States means that UCs have a higher need for both physical and mental health care than the general teenage population in the United States. That said, as other speakers have highlighted, they frequently have less access to these resources that they so desperately need. Barriers to access can be language access, especially in the more rural communities. We see that a lot in northern Michigan. There may be no one who speaks a child's native language that is able to provide them like mental health services, or there may be, for example, one Spanish-speaking counselor in an entire county. There's also a lot of stigma around mental health struggles in communities that we need to work to address. And there's always the issue of the overbearing cost of healthcare in America that bankrupts people regularly. So in Michigan, we're trying to address these issues head on. First, we're trying to build partnerships and engage in relationship building with community groups. We've been adding social work positions to our own staff, trying to really create a broader network of care and create conversations with these communities where we can see where specific needs are and try to address them head on. We're also doing legislative advocacy for language access, trying to require that state agencies and state-funded programs implement policies to ensure people with limited English proficiency have equal access to public services. We're also in our foster care homes in these big networks. We're trying to promote open conversations about trauma and mental health. And we're trying to encourage the development of more trauma-informed care strategies in the networks by the care providers. And we're also doing our best to implement trauma-informed practices in our own legal representation, which so frequently involves uncovering some traumatic history of when you're working to represent the child. We're also doing advocacy within schools to make sure that trauma responses are not treated as behavioral issues, and also to make sure that screenings for learning disabilities and ADHD that are frequently done in schools are taking into account cultural differences and different practices and how these might be expressed based on a child's background. Regarding labor, it's been mentioned already today during this seminar, so I don't want to rehash it too much, but it does happen that UCs are released to a sponsor that's predatory. The New York Times really highlighted this earlier this year. UCs are a very high-risk population for trafficking, in part due to their isolation, so we need to be vigilant on that. But the vast majority of children who are released to a sponsor are not released to a predatory sponsor. They're usually released to a more distant relative or a family friend who may themselves be undocumented and are facing all the struggles that we have already been talking about today of families trying to just provide support for these children, and they're taking in this additional child that's like their family friend out of the goodness of their heart. And the child ends up working because of the realities of poverty. And they end up working in poor conditions because they get a job where their sponsor is working and their sponsor may be undocumented themselves. So what it means is that we are trying to do our policies that help immigrants and immigrant families generally also will help UCs if we address population-wide problems. So we have other advocacy that we're doing in Michigan. We've got a lot of legislative advocacy going on right now. We're very hopeful because in the last election, Michigan turned fully blue, though by a very slim majority. Both houses in our legislature and our governor are currently blue. So we're hoping we can get some good bills passed. We have introduced a driver's licenses for all bill, trying to restore access to driver's licenses for all Michigan residents, regardless of immigration status. We're trying to invest in what's called the New Americans Fund, which is investing in English language learning, civics, and legal services. We're trying to address our workers' compensation issues, where all injured immigrant workers, regardless of legal status, should be eligible for workers' compensation. And on a more crimmigration front, we are trying to reduce, there are a lot of 365-day misdemeanor sentences. And once you hit that 1-year mark, it changes the immigration implications for a misdemeanor sentence. So we are asking that a lot of those 365-day sentences be reduced just to 364 days to prevent the loss of immigration status for minor crimes. And I'll pass it off. I think we're short on time.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we've gone a little over, but this was very, very helpful. So I think I'm going to pass it back to Gabby at this point. Thank you all for participating. It was a great discussion, and back to you, Gabby.
Thank you so much, Mo, for moderating such an informative conversation, and also special thanks to our panelists for all the work that you're doing to ensure that immigrant families have the resources that they need. We know that immigrant families come to the U.S. in search for a better life and better opportunities, and every person, no matter their immigration status, deserves dignity and respect, especially children who are the most vulnerable. And it's us as advocates to follow through and continue working to ensure that they have the life that they deserve. So thank you, everyone, and all the panelists from our different sessions today. We appreciate all the information and thoughtful conversations from all the panels today. And with that, I pass it back to you, Linda. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby. To continue engaging in this conversation and our work, check us out on social media for more. And let's give one final thank you to our audience for being with us today for this important conversation. Again, we'll share the slide deck and link to the recording in an email to all registrants by Friday. Before we close up for the day, we encourage you to just take a moment to share your feedback on today's event with us using the QR code on your screen or the link shared by my team in the chat. I encourage you to register for our next event, our 88th Legislative Debrief on July 20th. Thank you all for joining us today.